The DUNES case begins in the pale sand of Provincetown, where the wind keeps smoothing the same old paths, and tonight we sit with the file that finally gave the Lady of the Dunes her name. Settle in and let the case move slowly. You can imagine the morning light first, not bright yet, just thin and silvery over Race Point, with the beach grass bending in soft green blades, and the Atlantic breathing somewhere beyond the dunes. The sand has that dry, whispering sound under shoes, and the air carries salt, sun-warmed scrub, and the faint mineral smell of a place where weather has handled everything for years. In the DUNES case, the first page is not a laboratory report or a solved chart on a wall. It is a quiet summer place on the 26th of July, 1974, when a child walking with a dog came upon something that would ask for patience for almost half a century. You turn that first page gently, because even after all these years, the paper seems to remember the shock of being written on the Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a place of soft paths, low shrubs, and wind-polished silence. Her dog noticed what people had not yet noticed, and that small movement, a dog pulling toward a place in the sand, became the beginning of one of Massachusetts' longest unidentified person cases. We don't hurry through that moment. We let it stay quiet, because the person found there was not a symbol or a puzzle piece. She was a woman who had once had a name, a family, a voice, and ordinary days that mattered. For many years, investigators called her the Lady of the Dunes. You see the phrase on folders, typed reports, newspaper clippings, and old photocopies softened at the corners by many hands. It sounds almost like folklore. But inside the folder, the name was really an admission. They did not know who she was. They knew where she had been found, in the dunes near Provincetown, and they knew small things that felt painfully human. She had auburn or reddish-brown hair. Her toenails had been painted pink. Near her were ordinary items, including denim and a bandana, the sort of things you might pack for a summer trip without thinking they would ever become evidence. As you sit beside the desk lamp tonight, the strange part is how small some of the clues are. The DUNES case did not wait 48 years because no one cared. It waited because the evidence was partial, weathered, and stubborn. Detectives had sand, cloth, dental work, witness memories, old travel hints, and later, bone that had to be treated carefully in a laboratory far from the beach. You can feel the shift already, from the open air of Race Point to the cooler stillness of an evidence room, where cardboard boxes give off the dry smell of old paper and metal filing cabinets click shut with a soft, final sound. The first investigators had to begin with what was in front of them. They walked the dunes and looked at the tracks and the sand. They noted tire marks nearby, and they studied the objects that had remained, because sometimes a case speaks through what is left in place. You can picture them moving slowly through the heat, their shoes sinking a little, the wind trying to erase edges as fast as they could observe them. There was no modern DNA database waiting for them in 1974. There was no genealogy team ready to build a family tree from a fragile genetic thread. There were just people, notebooks, cameras, measurements, and the patient discipline of writing down what the day offered. For a long time, the Lady of the Dunes was described through absence. No name, no confirmed home, no clear reason why she had come to Provincetown, or whether Provincetown was only one stop in a longer movement across the country. You hold that absence carefully, because absence is not emptiness in a cold case. It has weight. It presses on families who wonder, on detectives who retire with unfinished questions, and on towns that learn to repeat a story without being able to complete it. In this file, the absence lasted through decades of changing technology, changing offices, and changing faces around the same old table. The details that remained were handled again and again. You see the dental notes first, because teeth were one of the earliest hopes. The woman had expensive dental work, the kind that suggested money had been spent somewhere, by someone, in a dentist's chair with bright light overhead and the clean smell of polish in the air. Investigators hoped those records might lead back to a name. They compared charts, sent inquiries, and waited for replies that arrived by mail or telephone, slowly, one office at a time. But the match did not come, and the folder thickened with careful failures. You can feel how different detective work was then. A lead might mean a typed letter sent to another state, a phone call placed through an office switchboard, or a photocopy mailed to someone who might recognize a face. The paper would travel slowly. A clerk might pull a drawer. A dentist might check old files in a room where the air smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Then an answer would come back, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks later, usually saying no. We stay with that rhythm because this case was built from many quiet no's before it ever reached a yes. In those early years, the DUNES case gathered theories the way old beaches gathered driftwood. Some were careful, some were unlikely, some were only the product of people trying to make sense of a face without a name. A facial reconstruction was made, and later another, because the human mind wants to meet a person eye to eye. You can imagine the clay model in an office, still and pale under fluorescent light, while detectives hoped someone, somewhere, would see a resemblance and feel a memory stir. It was not enough, but it was an act of trying. Years passed, and the Lady of the Dunes stayed in the files. You turn another page, and now the paper is older. The type is a little uneven, the photocopy a little grey, the photograph a little softened by reproduction. There are notes about possible matches, names of missing women, leads from people who thought they recognized the reconstruction, and other leads that must have seemed promising for a few days before fading back into uncertainty. The room around you feels cooler now, as if the case has moved from summer sand into a basement archive. You can hear the low hum of lights overhead and the small scrape of a chair being pulled closer to a table. One of the patient things about the DUNES case is how many times it had to begin again. In 1980, investigators exhumed the remains, hoping new examination might reveal something missed the first time. That word, exhumed, can sound harsh, but in a cold case file, it often means a careful return. It means people were still asking. It means someone believed the unidentified woman deserved another chance to be known. You can picture the solemn work, the damp earth, the quiet voices, and then the remains returning to examination under controlled light, where every detail was treated as if it might be the one that finally opened the door. The door stayed closed then. The science of the time could only do so much. But the effort mattered, because cold cases are not solved only in the final moment. They are held together by all the earlier attempts that preserve evidence, correct estimates, and keep a record from being lost. You can imagine a detective placing another report into the file, not with triumph, but with steadiness. The paper slides in. The folder grows thicker. Somewhere the dunes keep moving in wind and rain, while the case rests in a cabinet and waits for a future no one can quite see yet. By the year 2000, the world around the file had changed. Computers sat on desks. DNA testing had become part of criminal investigation, in ways that would have sounded almost impossible in 1974. The Lady of the Dunes was exhumed again, and this time the hope was different. It was not only a face, or a dental chart, or a remembered missing person poster. It was genetic identity, the deep biological signature carried in the body itself. You can imagine the careful labeling, the sterile containers, the gloved hands, and the faint chemical smell of a lab where old evidence meets new questions. Even then, it wasn't simple. Old remains do not always yield easy answers. Time changes things. Burial changes things. Earlier preservation methods can complicate later testing. The evidence had been through decades of handling, examination, and environmental exposure, and the science had to work with whatever was still there. You sit with that because it is one of the most human parts of forensic work. A laboratory may look clean and exact, with white counters and quiet machines, but it is also a place of patience, where people ask very small traces to speak after a very long silence. The DUNES case kept its silence a while longer. Investigators continued comparing, excluding, and revisiting. Names came into the file and moved out again. A missing woman here, a resemblance there, a theory that briefly gathered attention, then could not hold. You can almost feel the paper texture under your thumb as each lead is turned over. Some pages are hopeful, some are disappointing. None are wasted, because every ruled-out name protects the truth from being mistaken for something close but wrong. There was Rory Jean Kessinger, a missing woman whose age and appearance once seemed worth checking. There were other women whose families wondered whether the Lady of the Dunes might be their missing sister or daughter. DNA would eventually rule some possibilities out, but before that, people had to live with the question. You can imagine how heavy that would feel, hearing about an unidentified woman found far away, then looking at an old photograph at home and wondering whether the face might be familiar. In a case like this, hope and dread can sit very close together, and investigators have to speak carefully. We move gently through those names, because every false lead belonged to another real life. It would be easy to treat them as clutter in the file, but you and I know better as we sit with the pages. Each one represented a family searching, a detective checking, a phone call made, and a silence either confirmed or left unresolved. The Dunes case became a meeting place for many absences, and that is part of why it stayed in public memory. It was one woman, one unknown identity, and also a symbol of all the people who can vanish from ordinary records. Then there was the strange lead from the movies, the one people often remember because it feels so unusual beside the careful forensic work. Years after the discovery, someone watching the film Jaws noticed a woman in a beach crowd scene. She wore a blue bandana and jeans, and for a moment, the image seemed to echo the evidence from Provincetown. You can picture the film paused on a screen, the grain of the old image, the crowded 4th of July beach, the tiny figure caught in the background of a famous movie. It is the kind of clue that feels almost too strange to ignore. But strange is not the same as certain. The Jaws idea was interesting because the movie had been filmed in Massachusetts, and because the clothing seemed to resemble items associated with the Lady of the Dunes. Yet resemblance can be a soft thing. A bandana can be common, denim can be common. A face in a crowd can invite the mind to complete what the image does not prove. As you review that page, you can appreciate why investigators listened and also why they had to remain cautious. Cold case work requires imagination, but it also requires restraint. That restraint is one of the quieter virtues in the Dunes case. You can follow a possibility without loving it too much. You can write it down, check it, compare it, and then let it rest if the evidence does not support it. The movie lead did not solve the case, but it shows how widely the unknown woman had entered public thought. People wanted to help. They looked at old films, old photographs, and old memories. They studied small details, sometimes in the dim light of a living room, because the unidentified woman in the dunes had become someone many people wanted to return to herself. For decades, the evidence that mattered most may have looked less dramatic than the theories around it. It was not the paused film image, or the rumors, or the most memorable newspaper phrase. It was the biological trace that could one day be read with enough precision to lead investigators into family lines. You can imagine that trace waiting quietly, not glowing, not announcing itself, just held in bone and preserved through procedure, storage, and repeated attempts. The weird evidence that solved the Dunes case was weird partly because it was so small. It was a whisper strong enough, eventually, to cross generations. By the time investigative genealogy entered the file, the world had changed again. People had begun to understand that DNA could do more than match one person directly to another sample. It could build a path through relatives, shared ancestry, public records, and patient family tree work. You might picture not a single machine giving an answer, but a desk covered with names, dates, marriage records, census lines, and little notes written beside branches. The work is almost archival in spirit. It smells less like the ocean now and more like paper, coffee gone cool, and the faint warmth of a computer left on through the evening. In 2022, the remains connected to the Lady of the Dunes were sent for advanced DNA work. The sample was difficult, as old samples often are, but the effort produced a profile strong enough to begin the genealogical search. You can imagine the quiet concentration in the lab, the sound of a sealed packet opening, the bright, clean light, the careful movement of hands that no contamination can undo months of work. Nothing about that moment looks like drama from the outside. It looks like patience wearing gloves. And then somewhere in the data, family began to appear. Not the full answer at once. Not a name written in bright ink across the top of the file. More likely it appeared as connections, distant relatives, shared segments, and lines that had to be traced backward before they could be followed forward. You sit with the genealogist now, as if beside another lamp, this one shining on birth records and family names. The work is slow enough for sleep. A surname is checked, a marriage is found, a child is listed. A branch bends toward Tennessee, Michigan, California, and finally toward a woman who had been missing from her own story. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. The first time you place that name beside the phrase Lady of the Dunes, the file changes shape. It does not become happy, it does not become simple, but it becomes more truthful. Ruth Marie Terry was born in Tennessee, in the hills and small communities far from the Cape Cod sand where she would later be found. She had connections to Michigan and California. She had family who had wondered in different ways and over many years where she had gone. You can feel the old label loosen now, not disappear exactly, but step back so the person can come forward. Ruth was 37 years old when her life ended in 1974. For almost 48 years, the public knew her by the landscape where she was found, while her family history sat somewhere else, waiting for science and paperwork to meet. You can imagine how strange that is. One file in Massachusetts, one set of family memories in other states, each incomplete without the other. The Dunes case was solved, not by one odd clue alone, but by the joining of evidence and ancestry, laboratory work and old records, bone and names, the physical and the remembered, when officials announced her identification on the 31st of October 2022. The old case finally had a human center again. You can picture reporters writing the name carefully, investigators speaking with measured voices, and family members receiving news that answered one question while opening others. It is hard to overstate the importance of a name in a cold case. A name lets records connect, a name lets relatives grieve with clearer knowledge, a name lets detectives look backward through a real life instead of searching through the fog of an unknown description. But the Dunes case was not finished the moment Ruth Marie Terry was identified. You turn the next page, and the file becomes both clearer and heavier. Once investigators knew who she was, they could ask who had been near her in the months before she disappeared from view. They could trace relationships, travel, marriages, statements and old stories that had once floated without connection. One name became especially important, Guy Rockwell Moldavin, Ruth's husband, whom she had married only months before her death. Here, too, we keep the tone careful. Moldavin was not a sudden character dropped into a mystery for effect. He was part of Ruth's actual life, and investigators had to review what could be established through records and witness accounts. Ruth and Moldavin had traveled after their marriage. Family members later recalled visits and remarks about going to Massachusetts. Afterward, according to public accounts, Moldavin returned without her and gave explanations that did not bring her home. You can imagine those conversations lingering in family memory for decades. Ordinary rooms holding words that later took on new weight. This is one of the strange things about evidence. Sometimes it is not strange because it looks unusual. Sometimes it is strange because no one knows, at the time, that it is evidence at all. A comment in a kitchen, a car in a driveway, a husband arriving alone, a family member remembering that Ruth had not seemed fully herself. These are not laboratory objects. They are fragments of lived experience, and in a cold case, they can wait years before anyone knows where they belong. As you sit with this part of the Dunes case, you can feel the investigation folding two timelines together. One timeline begins in Provincetown, with sand, beach grass, and an unidentified woman. The other begins in Ruth's known life, with birth records, family visits, marriage documents, travel, and absence. For decades, those timelines ran separately. Once Genealogy gave Ruth back her name, the two lines could finally meet. That meeting is what made the old evidence meaningful in a new way. The weird evidence, then, was not only the DNA profile drawn from difficult remains, it was also the pattern that appeared after the name was known. The dental work mattered. The old clothing mattered. The exhumations mattered. The family tree mattered. The statements from relatives mattered. The records of marriage and travel mattered. You can think of the case as a long table covered with small objects, none of them enough alone, until someone finally brings the missing label and the arrangement becomes visible. In 2023, authorities stated that Guy Rockwell Moldovan was responsible for Ruth Marie Terry's death. He had died in 2002, so there could be no trial, no courtroom testimony, and no living suspect sitting across from investigators. That fact gives the ending a muted quality. The case could be closed by the authorities, and Ruth could be identified, but the full human explanation could not be asked from the person they named. You feel that quiet limit in the file, like the last page ending before every question has been answered. Still, there is meaning in what was recovered. Ruth Marie Terry was no longer an unknown woman in the dunes. Her son, relatives, investigators, and the public could say her name. The place remained the same: Race Point, Provincetown, Cape Cod, with its salt air and shifting sand. But the file no longer had to begin with a nameless description. It could begin with Ruth. That is a profound change, even when it comes late. You might pause here, as a detective would, and rest your hand on the closed folder for a moment. The room is quiet. The lamp makes a small circle of amber light on the desk. Outside, perhaps rain taps softly against a window, or perhaps the night is still enough that you can hear the building settle. The Dunes case teaches a very patient lesson about evidence. Some clues are loud for a season and then fade. Others are nearly invisible for decades, waiting for the world to invent the right way to hear them. The first clue was a place. The dunes held what they held until someone noticed. And we return to that place now. Slowly, because the sand itself is part of the case's memory. Race Point is not a dark place by nature. It is open, wind-bright, and shaped by weather, with beach grass that whispers against itself, and paths that can appear and disappear under moving sand. You can walk there and feel how the landscape refuses straight lines. A dune rises, then dips. A trail bends. The ocean sounds near, then far. In such a place, investigators in 1974 had to make order from softness, measuring what the wind was already trying to smooth away. You can picture a measuring tape laid across the sand, its metal edge catching the sun, while a detective kneels and tries to keep the line straight against the breeze. The dunes would not behave like a room, or a street, or a house with fixed corners. They shifted underfoot, and each footprint made another mark to be sorted from the rest. You sit with that difficulty for a while, because the dunes case began in a landscape that was beautiful and imprecise, a place where nature kept touching the evidence. The sound there would have been soft but constant, wind moving through dry grass, distant gulls over the water, the dull hush of waves, arriving and withdrawing beyond the rise of sand. You can imagine investigators speaking in low voices, not because they were trying to be dramatic, but because some places make people quiet. A beach can be bright and ordinary for one person, and a serious work site for another, all in the same hour. The first reports tried to turn that open place into recordable fact. Distance from the road, position in the dunes, clothing nearby, personal details observed with care. You can almost feel the pressure on the investigator's pencil, the way a field note must capture what cannot be preserved forever. In the Dunes case, those early notes became unusually important, because later generations would depend on them when the original scene was long gone. That is one of the patient lessons we find here. A cold case can become old, but its first day never stops mattering. If the early work is careful, later science has something to stand on. If the early work is careless, later science may arrive with nowhere to place its feet. As you turn the pages, you begin to notice how much of the final answer rested on people who could not have known what tools would exist decades later. They preserved what they could. They photographed what they could. They described the woman, the objects, and the condition of the scene as fully as their moment allowed. You can feel the texture of those records now. Thin paper in a folder, the ink a little faded, the language formal but human underneath. The Dunes case did not need those first investigators to predict forensic genealogy. It needed them to keep faith with the evidence in front of them. One item that stayed in public memory was the blue bandana. It was ordinary, almost too ordinary, a piece of cloth that might have belonged to any summer traveler. You can imagine it faded by salt air, creased from use, holding the faint roughness of cotton against the fingers. In a different life, it might have been tied around hair, tucked into a bag, or worn against the sun. In the Dunes case, it became one of those small things people returned to, because small things sometimes carry the feeling of a person more strongly than official descriptions do. There was denim too, another plain material from an ordinary wardrobe. Denim has weight when folded, a dry scrape when handled, and a familiar blue that belongs to work, travel, and casual days. You may have touched fabric like it 1,000 times without thinking. That is why such evidence can feel intimate in an old file. It reminds you that Ruth Marie Terry, before anyone knew her name again, had dressed for a day like anyone else, with practical cloth and summer color. The pink polish on her toenails was another detail people remembered. We mention it softly because it is personal in a way that statistics are not. Someone had painted those nails before the Dunes, perhaps Ruth herself, perhaps in a quiet room with a bottle open on a table and the sharp, sweet smell of polish in the air. You can hold that detail without turning it into decoration. It is simply evidence of care, of a body lived in, of a woman who had ordinary habits before the file reduced her to questions. Investigators also noted dental work, and you can sense why that mattered so much. Dental records were one of the strongest identification tools available at the time, especially when fingerprints and direct recognition were not possible. A dentist's chart could be a map, if the right office could be found. You can imagine the cool vinyl of a dental chair, the little tray of instruments, the light angled close, and somewhere in a drawer, the record that might have named her if anyone had known where to ask. But knowing that dental work existed was not the same as knowing who had done it. The country was large. Records were scattered. People moved. Offices closed. Charts stayed in cabinets, were transferred, misplaced, or destroyed according to ordinary business routines. In the Dunes case, the teeth were a clue, but they were also a reminder of how hard it was to search before networks became instant and databases became familiar. You sit now with the slow mechanics of that search. A call goes out. A description is circulated. A dentist somewhere opens a drawer and checks through paper envelopes. Another office says they have no match. A state agency sends back a typed reply. Each answer travels at human speed, and each no is filed without ceremony. The work does not feel dramatic when you watch it closely. It feels like endurance. The strange evidence was not only strange because it was unusual. It was strange because each piece seemed close to speaking, but not close enough. The bandana suggested a person, not a name. The dental work suggested a history, not an address. The clothing suggested a season, not a timeline. You can feel the investigators learning the shape of the problem. The Dunes case was full of clues that were real, but incomplete. That incompleteness shaped the first decade. The woman in the Dunes was buried, then later brought back into examination, then returned again, as science and hope shifted. Each return carried a quiet promise that nobody was letting the file disappear. You can imagine the records box being opened after months or years, the cardboard lid lifting with a dry sigh, the tabs inside showing dates from different eras. A cold case is not one investigation. It is a series of people agreeing, at different times, to pick up the same thread. In Provincetown, the story also became part of local memory. The Dunes. The summer of 1974. The unidentified woman. The haunting label that was never meant to replace a name. You might hear it repeated in a newspaper archive, in a local history conversation, or in the careful voice of someone who remembered when the discovery was first reported. The town was known for artists, visitors, beaches, and weathered houses near the end of Cape Cod. Yet inside that beautiful place, the Dunes case remained a quiet, unresolved presence. You can imagine the seasons passing over Race Point, summer heat flattening the beach grass, autumn storms pressing rain into the sand, winter wind making the landscape feel pale and bare, spring returning with low shrubs and birdsong. The place kept changing, while the old file stayed still. That contrast is part of what makes cold cases feel so human. the world refuses to pause, even when a question remains unanswered. As years moved forward, investigators looked for matches among missing women. They compared height, age, hair color, dental details, and circumstances of disappearance. You can sit beside them in that work and feel its careful humility. A possible match can never be treated as truth because it feels close. It must be checked and sometimes checked again, because behind every possible name is another family waiting for an answer that may not be theirs. The name Rory Jean Kessinger appeared in that larger history. She was a missing woman whose circumstances once seemed worth exploring in relation to the Lady of the Dunes. For a time, some wondered if the unknown woman in Provincetown might be her. You can imagine the cautious hope such a possibility would create, the way investigators might compare dates and descriptions while refusing to promise too much. Later DNA testing ruled that possibility out, and the file had to absorb another careful disappointment. There were others as well. Some names came from official missing person records. Some came from tips. Some came from members of the public who saw a reconstruction and felt a jolt of recognition. The Dunes case invited those responses because the face was unfinished in the public mind. When a person has no name, strangers may project memory onto them, not out of carelessness, but out of the deep human need to connect an unknown face to someone loved. You can feel that need in the reconstructions. A clay face is not a person, and investigators know that. It is an approximation, a bridge built from bone structure, medical knowledge, and artistic judgment. Yet people respond to faces. They pause over eyes, hair, cheekbones, and the shape of a mouth. They ask themselves who it reminds them of. In the Dunes case, each reconstruction was an invitation to memory, and each one carried the hope that someone would whisper, "I know her." The reconstructions changed over time because methods changed and because each new attempt tried to correct the limits of the last. You can picture the studio or forensic workspace with tools arranged neatly, clay pressed and smoothed, photographs nearby, and a quiet concentration around the table. The air might smell faintly of dust, plaster, and warmed material under the fingers. This, too, was detective work. Not chasing, not confronting, just making a face visible enough that recognition might come. Recognition did not come that way. Or if it came in fragments, it did not bring the confirmed answer. Still, the reconstructions mattered. They kept the Lady of the Dunes in public view. They gave newspapers something to show. They gave detectives a way to ask for help. You can think of them as lanterns placed along a long road, not bright enough to reveal the end, but enough to keep the path from vanishing completely. Then, in the background of all this, forensic science kept growing. DNA work moved from rare and experimental to expected and increasingly refined. Cold case units began looking at old evidence with new eyes. Across the country, unidentified people recovered their names through methods earlier investigators could not have imagined. You can sense how the Dunes case waited at the edge of that change, old enough to be difficult, but preserved enough to remain possible. The first DNA efforts did not instantly solve it. That matters. We sometimes talk about modern testing as if it arrives like a key and every lock opens. But old cases resist. Samples degrade. Profiles may be partial. Contamination has to be considered. Earlier handling may have followed older standards that were perfectly normal at the time, but challenging by modern laboratory expectations. As you read, you learn to respect the slow uncertainty of science, because real forensic work often advances in small, cautious steps. You can imagine technicians working with material that had already passed through many hands and many years. The laboratory has its own quiet weather: cold storage, clean benches, disposable gloves, the sterile smell of processed air. Labels written with exactness. There is no room for romance in that space, and yet the purpose is deeply human. Someone is trying to return a name to a woman found in the dunes. The word profile appears in the file, and it sounds plain. But behind it is a tremendous amount of work. A DNA profile is not a portrait, not a memory, and not a story. It is a pattern, a readable arrangement that can connect one person to another through biology. You sit with that thought, because it is almost tender in its own way. The body carries family even when records fail, even when witnesses are gone, even when a name has been missing for decades. Investigative genealogy changed the meaning of that profile. A direct match would have been simpler, but direct matches depend on someone being in a particular database in a particular way. Genealogy works differently. It looks for relatives, sometimes distant ones, then builds outward and backward through records until the unknown person begins to take shape. You can imagine a researcher with a cup of tea gone lukewarm, clicking through public records, checking one spelling against another, waiting for a branch to make sense. The work has a tactile feeling, even when it happens on a screen. Old census pages appear in scanned grey. Marriage records show names written by clerks long gone. Birthplaces repeat. Dates line up or refuse to line up. You can almost hear the soft tap of keys and the tiny click of a mouse in a quiet room after midnight. In the DUNES case, the answer came not through one spectacular object, but through this accumulation of patient confirmations. A family tree is a different kind of evidence from a bandana. It has branches instead of fibers. It has absences where people moved, changed names, married, divorced, or vanished from records. You have to read it patiently, because families are not tidy charts in real life. They are migrations, remarriages, nicknames, misspellings, secrets, and ordinary paperwork. When you work through one, you feel both the structure and the softness of human life. Ruth Marie Terry emerged from that work gradually. Born Ruth Marie Terry in Tennessee, she belonged to a real family line that could be traced, checked, and connected. She was not a local legend or a nameless beach mystery anymore. She had relatives. She had records. She had a path through the world. You can imagine the moment when the genealogical search narrowed enough that investigators could say, not yet publicly perhaps, but within the work itself, this may be her. Even then, caution remained. A possible genealogical identification has to be confirmed. Investigators may seek additional family DNA, compare records, and make sure the conclusion holds. That restraint protects everyone involved. It protects the family from error. It protects the case from false certainty. It protects the dignity of the person being identified. In the DUNES case, the final public announcement came only after that slow work had done what it needed to do. When the name was released, Ruth's life began to return in fragments. She had been connected to Tennessee, Michigan, and California. She had been married more than once. She had family who remembered her. She had not been some isolated figure belonging only to the DUNES. You can feel the file widen as those details arrive. The case no longer points only to Race Point. It reaches back through houses, roads, family rooms, official records, and conversations that happened far from Cape Cod. The human mind wants a solved case to feel complete, but with Ruth, the identification answered one question and sharpened others. Who last saw her? What was said about her absence? How did her path lead to Massachusetts? What did relatives remember? And what had seemed odd, only in hindsight? You sit with those questions carefully, because they are not meant to wake the listener with alarm. They are the soft, persistent questions of a detective rereading a file under a lamp. Guy Rockwell Muldervin entered the renewed investigation because he was Ruth's husband at the time. Public accounts describe him as a man with a troubling past and a pattern investigators could not ignore. Ruth had married him in the months before her death, and after she disappeared from family view, he reportedly gave explanations that did not bring clarity. You can imagine investigators placing those statements beside travel records, family memories, and the newly confirmed identity, watching the pieces settle into a more coherent arrangement. There is an unusual patience required when the person suspected is no longer alive. You cannot interview him again. You cannot watch his reaction to a question. You cannot ask him why a statement changed, or why a journey ended without Ruth. The investigation becomes archival in a deeper sense. It depends on documents, surviving witnesses, recorded memories, and the quiet comparison of what one person said against what the evidence can support. The room feels stiller when you understand that. Muldervin had died in 2002, long before Ruth was publicly identified. That meant the legal shape of the case would always be limited. Authorities could name responsibility based on their investigation, but there would be no trial and no verdict from a jury. You can feel how unsatisfying that can be, even when the conclusion is important. Cold cases often give back pieces, not everything. They return a name, a likely path, a responsible person, and still leave spaces where a living answer might have been. As you turn another page, the oddest part may be how the evidence from the beginning changed meaning after the end of the genealogical search. The bandana, once only a clue to a summer woman in the dunes, became part of Ruth's last known world. The dental work, once a route into an unknown identity, became one feature among many in a known life. The place, once the main descriptor, became the place where Ruth was found, not the thing that defined her. The Dunes case changed because the center changed. This is why names matter so much in patient detective work. An unidentified person case begins with descriptors: approximate age, hair color, clothing, location, date found, height estimate, dental notes. Those descriptors are necessary, and investigators use them with care, but they are not the same as a life. Once a name returns, the file can grow roots. It can connect to birth certificates, school memories, relatives, photographs, marriages, and all the ordinary evidence of having been here. You can imagine a family member hearing the name spoken in connection with the Lady of the Dunes and feeling time fold strangely. Nearly half a century is long enough for children to become old, for houses to be sold, for photographs to fade in boxes, for stories to be told with uncertainty. Then one day, the uncertainty changes. Not into ease, exactly, but into knowledge. That knowledge can be painful, but it can also end a particular kind of waiting. There is a quiet dignity in that ending of waiting. It does not erase grief. It does not restore the missing years, but it lets people place the question somewhere more solid. You can picture an old photograph being held a little longer, a name written into an article, a record corrected, a grave understood differently. In the Dunes case, the weird evidence solved the deepest identity question by letting Ruth's family history and forensic science recognize each other at last. The Dunes themselves did not explain her. They only held her. That distinction is important. For years, the landscape gave her a name because no other name was known. But the landscape was never the whole story. Ruth came from a family, from places inland and far away, from relationships and decisions and travels. You can feel the case becoming more compassionate as it becomes more specific. The more we know, the less she belongs to mystery alone. Still, the place remains vivid. Race Point has a certain end-of-the-world feeling, though not a frightening one. It is simply far out on the Cape, where roads narrow towards sand, water, and sky. The light can be sharp there, or misted by sea air. The sand can feel hot in summer and hard under winter cold. You can imagine walking slowly along a path through the beach grass, not searching now, just remembering how a place can hold a question longer than any person expects. In 1974, Provincetown was also a summer town full of movement. Visitors came and went. Cars arrived with out-of-state plates. People rented rooms, walked beaches, ate in busy places, and disappeared back into the flow of travel. That made the investigation harder. An unknown woman found in a destination town might be local, or she might have arrived only briefly. She might have been seen by many people, but remembered by none clearly enough. You can hear the soft clatter of restaurant dishes, the murmur of sidewalks, the tide of strangers moving through a small place. Investigators had to ask who she might have been among all that movement. A vacationer, a traveler passing through, someone staying with another person, someone whose absence would be noticed somewhere else, but not immediately connected to Cape Cod. You sit with the uncertainty because travel can blur the edges of a life in records. A person can leave one state, cross into another, and become difficult to place if no one knows which road to follow. That is where family memory later mattered. Once Ruth's name was known, relatives could describe pieces of her life that had never been connected to the Dunes case before. Public accounts noted that she had married Moldavan and had traveled with him. Family stories about his explanations after Ruth was gone became part of the renewed understanding. You can imagine those old memories being handled carefully in interviews, not as gossip, but as evidence filtered through time, grief, and hindsight. Hindsight is powerful, and detectives have to use it gently. A remark that seemed merely odd years ago may seem important after a body is identified. A trip that seemed ordinary may take on new meaning. A person's absence may look different when placed beside a known date and place. But memory is delicate. It has texture, like thin paper, and can tear if pulled too hard. In the DUNES case, investigators needed memory, but they also needed records to steady it. The records gave structure, marriage dates, locations, known movements, previous investigations involving Moldavin, statements made after Ruth was no longer seen. Each detail was checked against the others. You can picture a timeline drawn on a legal pad, with dates written in blue ink and arrows connecting events across states. The work is almost meditative because it asks for attention without hurry. One line at a time, one date at a time, one inconsistency considered without raising the voice. The public often remembers cold cases by their most unusual detail, and the DUNES case has several. The beach, the bandana, the movie theory, the long delay before identification, the genealogy. Yet inside the actual work, the unusual and the ordinary depend on each other. A strange clue may draw attention, but an ordinary record may confirm the path. A dramatic theory may keep the case in memory, but a quiet lab result may do the real turning. You can see that balance in the Jaws theory. It was a strange and oddly compelling idea, born from someone noticing a woman in the background of a famous film. The movie had been filmed not terribly far away, on Martha's Vineyard, and the clothing in the beach scene looked, to some eyes, like the clothing associated with the Lady of the Dunes. You can imagine the frame frozen, the crowd grainy, the woman small in the image, the blue bandana catching attention like a tiny flag. That theory never became the answer. It remains one of those curious side rooms in the case, a place people visit because it feels eerie in the way coincidences can feel eerie. But it also shows the public trying to participate in patient detective work. Someone looked closely. Someone compared details. Someone wondered if an image meant more than it seemed. You and I can acknowledge that effort while also letting the evidence return to firmer ground. There is comfort, strangely, in the fact that the solution did not come from a movie frame. It came from something quieter and more reliable, though also more difficult. DNA, genealogy, public records, and investigative follow-through. The case was not solved by the most memorable story attached to it. It was solved by the stubborn method of checking what could be checked until a name emerged. That is often how patient detective work really looks. The phrase, weird evidence, can make us expect something theatrical, but here it means something subtler. A genetic fragment from an old, unidentified remains case is weird because it belongs to both the body and the family tree. It is physical, but it points into history. It is microscopic, but it can open boxes of photographs and records across generations. You can sit with that quiet wonder, the way a tiny readable trace can travel farther than a suitcase, farther than a memory, farther than a rumor. It also means the evidence had to be protected long before it could be understood. The investigators of the 1970s did not know that forensic genealogy would one day exist. They could not know that distant relatives might help identify an unknown woman almost 50 years later. But by preserving remains, maintaining records, and keeping the case alive, they made that later work possible. You can feel the chain of care passing from one era to another, hand to hand, folder to folder. Lab to lab, cold case work is often described as reopening, but sometimes it is more like returning. You return to a file after the world changes. You return to evidence after science improves. You return to a witness after memory has aged, hoping the important parts remain. You return to a place, even if the place has shifted under weather and years. In the DUNES case, every return brought the same question back into the room. Who was she? For 48 years, that question was the center. It shaped every reconstruction, every comparison, every news article, every exhumation, every laboratory attempt. You can imagine the question written invisibly on the inside cover of the file. Who was she? Not what happened first. Not who was responsible first. Because without her name, all other questions floated. The answer, Ruth Marie Terry, did not solve every part of the case, but it anchored all the rest. The name Ruth has a simple sound. It is short, plain, and steady. Marie softens it. Terry places it in a family line. You can understand why investigators and writers began using the full name after the identification, because saying it fully restores a little of what the old label could not hold. Ruth Marie Terry was not a case title. She was a person whose identity had been separated from her for far too long. As you read deeper, you may notice how official language changes after identification. Reports can stop saying unidentified female and begin saying Ruth. Articles can stop leaning entirely on the Lady of the Dunes. Family statements can speak to a known person. That shift is more than vocabulary. It is a moral correction. The Dunes case had carried an absence in its very title, and the identification allowed the absence to be named. You can imagine the evidence room after the announcement, though of course the work would have continued in its official way. The same boxes, the same old photographs, the same reports. But now, perhaps, a label updated, a file cross-referenced, a name entered where no name had been before. The fluorescent lights still hum. The cabinet still closes with a metal click, yet the room feels different because the file now answers when called. There is another quiet layer to the story, and it has to do with how long families can live beside uncertainty. Ruth's relatives were not all waiting in the same way, because time and circumstance scatter people. Some may have wandered directly. Some may have inherited fragments. Some may have known only that a family story had an unresolved place in it. You can picture an old box of photographs, the corners curled, names written on the back in fading ink, and one face that becomes newly important after a call from investigators. When a cold case identification happens through genealogy, living relatives can become part of the evidence without ever having known the missing person well. A cousin, a niece, a child, or a distant family member may provide a sample or a family detail that confirms what the tree suggests. That is a tender kind of participation. It asks people to lend part of their own identity to help restore someone else's. In the Dunes case, that family connection helped carry Ruth back across the decades. You can feel how technology and kinship meet there. The machine reads markers. The genealogist builds trees. The investigator checks records. The family remembers. None of these alone is the whole answer. Together, they make a path. It is not a loud path. It is more like a narrow hallway in an archive, with shelves on both sides and a small pool of light moving forward as you walk. As Ruth's name returned, so did the possibility of understanding her final months. Investigators looked at her marriage to Guy Moldavin, the travel associated with them, and his later statements. Public reporting described how Moldavin had drawn law enforcement attention before Ruth's identification, including in connection with other missing family members from earlier years. You can feel why detectives would take that history seriously, though in our telling we keep the focus steady and careful. The task is not to darken the room. It is to understand why the file turned toward him. Moldavin's past created a pattern investigators could not set aside. Years before Ruth was found in Provincetown, his previous wife and stepdaughter had disappeared, and remains were later found in a septic tank on property connected to him. Those facts are heavy, and we do not linger on them for shock. We name them because they help explain why, once Ruth was identified, authorities saw her husband through a much clearer lens. You can imagine the old reports being pulled, the dates compared, the familiar quiet of one file opening another. This is how cold cases sometimes speak to each other. A detail in one investigation casts light on another. A name that seemed isolated becomes part of a wider pattern. Records from one county, one state, or one decade become relevant somewhere else entirely. You sit with that web of paperwork because it is not glamorous, but it is powerful. A detective following Ruth's case had to look not only at Cape Cod, but at the trail of a man whose life crossed several places and several losses. The Dunes case, once identified, became less about finding a stranger and more about tracing a relationship. That shift can feel subtle, but it changes everything. Before the name, investigators searched outward through missing person reports. After the name, they could search inward through Ruth's known connections. Who was closest to her? Who traveled with her? Who returned without her? Who explained her absence? You can feel the file narrowing, not with haste, but with gravity. The role of the son, family, and relatives in public accounts adds another human layer. Ruth had people connected to her, people whose lives were touched by the delay in knowing. You can imagine the strangeness of learning that a famous unidentified case was not distant at all, but belonged to your own family. The phrase, Lady of the Dunes, might have existed in newspapers and television segments for years, while Ruth's name lived somewhere else. Then the two became one. A cold case identification can make the public feel as if a mystery has been solved, but for relatives, it can feel far more personal and complicated. There may be relief, sorrow, anger, gratitude, and exhaustion in the same breath. You and I leave room for all of that. We do not decide what anyone should feel. We simply notice that the return of a name is never just a forensic milestone. It is a family event, arriving very late. The official announcement in October of 2022 gave the public the answer to the identity question. It also showed how much modern forensic genealogy had matured. Cases once thought nearly impossible were now being revisited across the country. You can imagine cold case detectives reading about each solved identification and thinking of their own shelves, their own boxes, their own nameless files. In that sense, Ruth's identification belonged to a larger movement, but it remained entirely specific to her. Specificity is what keeps the story humane. Ruth Marie Terry, Provincetown, Race Point, the 26th of July 1974. The blue bandana, the denim, the dental work, the genealogy, the husband named by authorities after death. These are not decorations. They are the places where the truth touches the table. You can run your finger along them gently, as if following raised print in an old book. The weathered quality of the case matters too. Nearly half a century changes the emotional temperature of an investigation. Witnesses age, detectives retire. Paper yellows, buildings change, laboratories improve, public interest rises and falls. The Dunes case moved through all of that, and still the central question survived. You can hear the quiet persistence in that survival, like a clock ticking in a room where nobody speaks for a long time. The exhumations are part of that persistence. They can sound repetitive when listed, but each one represented a renewed hope. In 1980, investigators tried again. In 2000, they tried again with new forensic possibilities. Later efforts built on those steps. You can picture the solemnity of returning to remains not because the past is being disturbed casually, but because the person has still not been fully served by the investigation. It is a form of patience that requires both respect and resolve. Each return would have created new paperwork. Chain of custody forms, laboratory submissions, medical examiner notes, updated reports. The dry administrative trail may seem far from the windswept dunes, but it is how evidence survives. You can smell copier toner, manila folders, and the faint dust inside archive drawers. You can hear a stapler close, a pen cap click, a phone ring once in a quiet office. These small sounds are part of the case too. The chain of custody is one of those plain phrases that holds a deep idea. It means the evidence is accounted for. It means people can say where it was, who handled it, and how it moved. In a case lasting decades, that becomes especially important. You can imagine the chain stretching across generations of officials, from the first responders in 1974 to the forensic scientists and genealogists of the 21st century. A weak link could have changed everything. The survival of usable genetic evidence was not guaranteed. That is why the final identification feels so improbable when you sit with the details. The remains had been found outdoors, examined, buried, exhumed, studied, and stored across changing standards and changing technologies. Yet, enough remained. Enough could be read. Enough could point beyond the dunes to a family line. The weirdness of that evidence is partly its endurance, its ability to remain meaningful after so much time had passed. You can think of the DNA as a quiet witness that could not speak until the right language existed. In 1974, the language was not ready. In 1980, it was still not ready for this kind of work. In 2000, the language had grown, but not enough for the full answer. By 2022, the vocabulary of forensic genealogy had become precise enough to listen. The witness had not changed as much as the listeners had. That thought has a calming shape. Sometimes the answer is not absent. Sometimes it is present, but unreadable. The work then becomes waiting without surrendering, preserving without knowing, returning without expecting the instant reward. You see that in the DUNES case over and over. The people who kept the file alive could not force the answer, but they could make sure the answer still had a place to arrive. And it did arrive, through a method that feels almost like patient detective work translated into biology. Genealogists look for shared ancestors. They build likely branches. They test hypotheses. They check obituaries, marriage records, birth records, addresses, and newspaper mentions. A mistaken branch can lead far away, so each step must be examined. You can imagine a desk at night, the blue-white glow of a screen, and a notebook full of names that slowly begin to circle one woman. The circles tightened around Ruth. That is the part we can let unfold slowly, because identification is not magic, it is narrowing. A group of possible family lines becomes smaller. A set of women who could fit becomes smaller. Dates begin to match. Known absence begins to match. Geography begins to make sense. The genealogist does not simply find a name and stop. The name has to withstand every test the file can place against it. Once Ruth's identity held, investigators could finally use traditional detective work in a sharper way. They could look for her known associates. They could examine her marriage. They could ask relatives what they remembered about Moldavin. They could revisit his prior history with the seriousness it demanded. You can feel how the old and new methods joined hands here. DNA opened the door, but interviews, records, and analysis walked through it. That joining is the heart of the DUNES case. The solution was not purely high-tech, and it was not purely old-fashioned. It was both. A sample in a lab, a family tree on a screen, a marriage record, a remembered trip, a husband returning without his wife, a prior pattern in old case files. The evidence had different textures, like objects spread across a table: paper, cloth, bone, ink, memory, and digital light. As you sit with those textures, the story becomes less about a single weird clue and more about the patience required to let different kinds of evidence speak at different times. Some evidence spoke immediately in 1974, but could only describe. Some evidence spoke later, when DNA became possible. Some evidence spoke only after Ruth's name unlocked the relevance of older memories. That sequence matters. A clue can be true for decades before it becomes useful. The word useful may sound too practical for a human life, but detectives need practical truth. They need something that can be checked, something that can narrow the field, something that can support a conclusion. Compassion without method may remember the victim, but it cannot solve the file. Method without compassion may solve a puzzle, but it forgets the person. The best cold case work keeps both on the desk at once. You can see that balance in the public handling of Ruth's identification. Officials gave her name. They explained the forensic process in broad terms. They later named Moldavin as responsible. They acknowledged limits created by his death. The language was measured, and measured language can be a form of respect. It does not pretend the late answer is complete. It simply says what the evidence now supports. For the listener, lying in the dark while the case moves slowly, there is another kind of patience here. You do not have to solve it yourself tonight. You are only turning pages with care. You are noticing how the bandana did not solve it, but stayed in memory. You are noticing how the dental work did not solve it, but preserved a route of inquiry. You are noticing how genealogy did not erase old detective work, but finally gave it a name to gather around. The file's long delay can feel almost physical. 48 years is enough time for paper to turn brittle and for ink to fade at the edges. It is enough time for a young officer to become old, for a child witness to carry a memory into adulthood, for a local story to become a legend. You can feel the weight of those years when you imagine the folder lifted from a shelf. It is not heavy like stone, but but it is heavy with waiting. Waiting is not passive in a case like this. It includes checking databases as they improve. It includes answering tips. It includes storing evidence properly. It includes saying yes when a new forensic method becomes available. It includes returning a call from someone who thinks they may know something, even if many similar calls have led nowhere. The DUNES case moved because people kept doing those small acts, and small acts are how long investigations breathe. You may notice that the beach discovery, the exhumations, the reconstructions, and the genealogy all have one shared quality. They require someone to look again. The girl and her dog noticed what others had not. Investigators returned to the remains. Artists rebuilt a face. Scientists retested evidence. Genealogists examined family lines. Detectives revisited old relationships after Ruth's name was known. Again and again, the case asked someone to look one more time, but gently, carefully, and with enough humility to be corrected. That humility is important. Many theories attached themselves to the Lady of the Dunes over the years. Some were sincere, some were imaginative, some were born from coincidence. The final answer required investigators to set theories beside evidence and let evidence decide. You can feel the quiet discipline in that. It is not enough for a story to be interesting. It has to be true, or at least supported enough to guide the next careful step. The Jaws theory is a perfect example of an interesting story that could not carry the whole weight. It had visual coincidence, geography, and public fascination. It made people look. It kept the case alive in conversation. But when Ruth's name emerged through DNA, the path to the answer ran through family lines, not a film crowd. The theory becomes part of the case's cultural history, not its solution. You can place it back in the folder that way, neither mocked nor mistaken for proof. In a quiet investigation, even discarded possibilities have value. They show what was considered. They prevent future repetition. They teach detectives where not to spend the next limited hour. You can imagine a margin note beside a ruled-out lead, brief and practical, closing one small door so the next person who opens the file does not have to walk through it again. The DUNES case contains many such doors. Each closed one made the open one easier to find. The open one led through Ruth's ancestry. That path can feel almost luminous, though the work itself was ordinary and exacting. A distant relative's shared DNA segment pointed toward a branch. Records identified families. Timelines narrowed possible identities. Ruth's absence from known life fit the unknown woman in Massachusetts. Then confirmation made the answer strong enough to speak aloud. You can imagine the stillness in the room before that conclusion was shared, the way important news often arrives quietly before the world hears it. There must have been a moment when someone looked at the name Ruth Marie Terry and understood that the old label had begun to end. The Lady of the Dunes had been necessary for a time, because without it the public had no way to refer to her. But necessary names can still be incomplete. Once Ruth returned, the old phrase became secondary. You can feel that shift as a kindness, the case title stepping aside for the person. Still, many people will always remember the case by its old name. That is understandable. The Lady of the Dunes is how the public held the mystery for decades. The phrase carries the landscape, the unresolved identity, the long wait. But tonight, as you sit with the file, you can let both names exist in their proper order. The DUNES case is the investigation. Ruth Marie Terry is the woman at its center. The son and relatives who received the news became part of the story's late human chapter. In public accounts, Ruth's family expressed the complexity of learning the truth after so long. You can imagine that complexity without needing to intrude on it. A phone call from investigators can divide time into before and after. A name in a national article can suddenly belong to your own bloodline. The world may call it a solved identification, but the family has to feel it in private rooms. Private rooms are where many cold cases truly live, not only in police offices, but in kitchens, bedrooms, attics, and drawers where old documents wait. A photograph in a frame, a letter in a box, a name mentioned at holidays, a question no one knows how to answer. The DUNES case reached into those rooms when Ruth was identified. It connected public mystery to private memory, and that connection is both tender and difficult. You can hear the quiet of such a room now. Maybe a clock on the wall, maybe the soft rustle of an envelope being opened, maybe someone reading an article slowly, then looking toward a photograph. There is no dramatic music in real life. There is only breath, silence, and the mind trying to make room for new knowledge. That is the emotional pace we keep, because it honors the truth better than urgency would. The investigation into Moldavin after Ruth's identification had its own restrained logic. Authorities did not have the luxury of direct confrontation, but they had the ability to review. They reviewed his relationship to Ruth, his statements, his known movements, and his earlier history. You can imagine the file on him being opened beside Ruth's. Two paper histories aligned under the same light. Dates speak to dates. Places speak to places. Patterns, once scattered, become visible. The name Guy Rockwell Moldavin brings a colder air into the file, but we do not let it take over the room. The center remains Ruth. Moldavin matters because investigators concluded he was responsible, and because his place in Ruth's life explains how the case shifted after identification. He was her husband, not a stranger drawn from rumor. He was connected by records and family accounts. That connection gave detectives a path that had been impossible when Ruth was still unnamed. You may notice how often identity comes before accountability in old cases. Without a name, it can be difficult to know who had motive, opportunity, or proximity. Once the person is identified, their world becomes searchable. Friends, spouses, employers, relatives, addresses, travel, and habits emerge. The DUNES case demonstrates that sequence clearly. Ruth's name did not merely answer who she was, it told investigators where to look for what happened around her. Even so, some questions will always remain shaped by Moldavin's death. He could not be charged. He could not be tried. He could not answer. Authorities could state responsibility, but the courtroom process that sometimes produces fuller public detail was not available. You can feel that limit without treating it as failure. Many cold cases solved after decades arrive after suspects, witnesses, or investigators have died. Time gives science new tools, but it also takes people away. That exchange is one of the quiet sorrows of delayed justice. The future brings methods the past did not have, while the past holds voices the future can no longer hear. In the DUNES case, forensic genealogy arrived in time to identify Ruth, but not in time for a living suspect to face proceedings. You can sit with that contradiction. It is not neat, and a sleep narration does not need to make it neat. It only needs to let the truth rest where it is. The truth that could be recovered was still significant. Ruth's identity, the investigative conclusion about Moldavin, the closing of the unidentified person question, the correction of records, the end of a particular uncertainty for relatives. These are not small things. They are the kind of late answers cold case detectives work for, even when they know the answer may arrive imperfectly. You can imagine a detective who worked the case for years hearing the name after retirement. Perhaps they remember the DUNES, the photographs, the reconstructions, the leads that went nowhere. Perhaps they feel relief mixed with the ache of all the time that passed. Cold case work often outlives individual careers. A file may begin in one generation and be solved by another. The DUNES case belonged to that long continuity of care. Continuity is not glamorous, but it is powerful. Someone keeps the records. Someone makes sure evidence is not discarded. Someone answers a journalist's question carefully. Someone approves another test. Someone enters data into a newer system. Someone calls a family member when the answer is ready. The case moves not in a rush, but by being carried. You can feel the hands beneath it. Many hands over many years, none of them holding it alone. The sensory world of the case changes as it moves through time. First, the hot, dry sand and salt wind of Provincetown. Then, the paper smell of reports and newspaper clippings. Then the cool, clinical air of the medical examiner's office. Then, the archive dust of old records. Then the clean brightness of the DNA lab. Then the quiet domestic atmosphere of family memory. Each setting adds a different texture, and each one holds part of the answer. You can rest in those textures. The sand underfoot, the cotton bandana between gloved fingers, the smooth surface of a dental chart, the tacky edge of an old photograph, the chilled plastic of a sample tube, the soft glow of a computer screen reflecting in a window at night. The DUNES case becomes less abstract when you let these objects stay near you. They remind you that investigation happens through things people can touch, smell, hear, and preserve. Preservation itself is a kind of hope. Not a loud hope, not a promise of quick resolution, but the quieter hope that someday a future method may need what you keep today. This is why old evidence rooms matter. They can look plain, even dull, with shelves, boxes, labels, and locks. Yet inside them are possibilities waiting for the right question. Ruth's case shows how an evidence room can become a bridge between an unknown woman in 1974 and a named woman in 2022. You can picture the box again. Maybe it is not dramatic at all. Brown cardboard, softened edges, a label with case numbers, tape marks, and handwriting from more than one era. Inside are papers that have been copied and recopied, photographs that should be handled carefully, reports in official language, and references to evidence stored elsewhere. The box does not know it is important. It simply waits, as boxes do, until someone opens it with purpose. When that purpose comes, the old file has to be read, both as history and as active evidence. A note from 1974 might contain a detail that matters now. A ruled-out identification might prevent confusion. A photograph might show an item better than a written description. You, as the quiet detective tonight, read slowly because rushing can miss the small hinge. Cold cases often turn on hinges too small to look important at first. The hinge in the DUNES case was the ability to connect a difficult DNA sample to living family lines. But the hinge also depended on earlier documentation, because a name produced by Genealogy had to fit the known facts. Ruth's age had to fit. Her disappearance from family contact had to fit. Her connections and timeline had to fit. The science pointed, and the records confirmed. You can feel the satisfaction of alignment, not as excitement, but as steadiness. Steadiness is the right feeling here. Nothing about Ruth's story becomes easy because it was solved in part. The loss remains. The years remain. The unanswered details remain. But the identification gives the case a floor, a place to stand. Before, everyone was reaching through fog. After, investigators could place their feet on known ground and look around with clearer eyes. Known ground included Ruth's marriage to Maldavin in the months before she was found. It included accounts that they traveled together. It included the fact that he later returned without her and offered explanations that did not lead to her. It included his prior history, reviewed through official records. When investigators put those facts together, they concluded he was responsible. You can read that conclusion without raising your pulse, because the file itself speaks in a low voice. A low voice is appropriate for old truth. It does not need to shout. The evidence has had years to settle. The conclusion arrived late, but not hastily. In a case like this, calm is not indifference. Calm is the manner of people who have learned that careful work must outlast emotion. You can feel that in the way detectives speak about cold cases, often with plain words, steady eyes, and a respect for what cannot be undone. The DUNES case also shows the difference between solving a case and healing everything around it. The identification solved the name. The investigative conclusion identified the person authorities believed responsible. But healing, if it comes at all, belongs to people over time. It cannot be issued in a press release. You can sense that distinction and let it remain. The file can close in one sense while the human meaning continues elsewhere. For now, though, we stay with the method. The weird evidence solved the DUNES case because it survived, and because science learned how to ask it better questions. The sample did not point to Ruth by itself in the old direct way. It pointed through relatives, through ancestry, through the quiet architecture of family. That is a strange and beautiful thing, in a restrained way. It means the answer was not held by one person alone. It was held across a web of kinship. Kinship can reach farther than memory. A distant relative may not know Ruth's name, may not know the story, may not know that their DNA could help identify someone found on a beach before they were born. Yet the biological connection remains. Genealogy makes use of that connection carefully, turning shared inheritance into investigative direction. You can imagine each relative as a small light on a large map, and the unknown person slowly appearing where the lights overlap. That image is gentle enough for the hour. A map on a desk, small lights, lines drawn in pencil, names becoming clearer. Outside the window, perhaps the rain has stopped, and the glass shows only the reflection of the lamp. You are not chasing the case. You are sitting with it. The Dunes case asks for that kind of sitting, because its answer came from patience more than force. The old photographs of the dunes, if you imagine them, may have a faded summer harshness, bright sand, darker grass, shadows tucked into low hollows. Photographs from older case files often have a flat, documentary look, as if the camera is refusing to interpret. You can almost feel the glossy paper under your fingertips and the slight curl at the edge. Such images do not solve a case by themselves, but they keep the first facts from drifting too far. Drift is always a danger in famous mysteries. Stories get retold, details blur. The most interesting theory may travel farther than the most accurate one. The Lady of the Dunes became known through articles, documentaries, websites, and local retellings. Some details stayed firm, while others gathered speculation. The final identification helped restore order, not by erasing the history of public interest, but by giving the story a factual center again. Ruth Marie Terry is that center. Every time you return to her name, the case becomes less misty. Ruth, not only the woman found in Race Point, Ruth, born in Tennessee, Ruth, connected to family across states, Ruth, married to Muldavin shortly before the end of her life, Ruth, identified through forensic genealogy after nearly 48 years. You can let the name repeat gently, not as emphasis, but as correction. The correction also belongs in databases. An unidentified person entry can be updated. A missing life can be connected to a found person. Official records can reflect reality more closely than before. That administrative work may sound cold, but it has moral value. Systems remember what people enter into them. When Ruth's name replaced the unknown label, the system itself became a little more truthful. You can imagine the database screen, simple and pale, with fields for name, date, location, status. Someone types carefully, someone verifies spelling, someone saves the update. There may be no sound beyond the keyboard and the quiet ventilation of an office, but the act matters. A woman who had been listed through descriptors is restored to a named record. It is a small ceremony made of procedure. Procedure is often where dignity lives in investigations. Forms, labels, evidence logs, confirmations, notifications. These may seem dry, but they prevent chaos. They ensure that truth can be checked. They make sure a family is told before the public reads a name. They protect the investigation from careless claims. In the Dunes case, procedure carried the final answer from laboratory result to official announcement. You can feel the care in the timing. The public did not need every preliminary uncertainty. The family needed to be approached with respect. Investigators needed confidence before speaking. The name, once released, would travel quickly. It would appear in headlines, broadcasts, and conversations among people who had followed the Lady of the Dunes for years. A name deserves to be introduced with steadiness. When Ruth's name did travel, it changed the old articles retrospectively. Every description of the unidentified woman now pointed to someone known. Every reconstruction could be seen as an attempt, however imperfect, to reach Ruth. Every mention of the blue bandana, the dental work, the dunes, and the long wait now belonged to a named life. You can feel the past rearranging itself around a new center, like papers being straightened on a desk. The emotional power of that rearrangement is quiet, but real. People who had followed the case from afar could finally stop wondering who she was. Local residents could connect the old story to a name. Forensic investigators could point to another example of why old evidence should be preserved. Families of other missing people could feel renewed hope, though also the ache of knowing their own answers had not yet arrived. The Dunes case became both specific and instructive. Instruction here does not mean a lesson delivered loudly. It means a pattern we notice. Preserve evidence, revisit old assumptions, use new tools carefully. Treat unidentified people as named people whose names are temporarily missing. Listen to families, check records. Be patient. You can hear those principles in the soft turning of each page, not as commands but as habits of good work. The habits matter because cold cases can outlast the initial urgency. After the first days, the public moves on. After the first months, tips slow. After the first years, the case may become a reference rather than an active daily investigation. But somewhere, if the system is working as it should, the file remains reachable. The evidence remains accounted for. The possibility of return remains alive. Ruth's identification is a testament to that reachability. Reachability is a humble word, but it fits. A file that can be found can be reviewed. Evidence that can be located can be tested. Records that can be interpreted can support a conclusion. If any of those had been lost, the DUNES case might have stayed nameless. You can imagine how many quiet decisions protected the path without anyone knowing which decision would matter most. Perhaps a clerk placed a folder in the right drawer. Perhaps a detective wrote one extra detail in a report. Perhaps an evidence technician followed a label protocol that seemed routine. Perhaps a later investigator chose not to let the case remain only a local legend. These acts are rarely celebrated, but they create the conditions for later breakthroughs. In long investigations, ordinary care can become extraordinary in hindsight. The word breakthrough itself may be too sharp for tonight, so we can think of Ruth's identification as a door opening after many hands had kept the hinges from rusting. The door opened onto her name, and beyond the name onto the life that had been waiting in records and memory. You can step through slowly. There is no need to hurry. The room beyond is full of documents, family lines, photographs, and the complicated figure of the man investigators would later name. Moldovin's connection to Ruth becomes more comprehensible when the name is known. Before identification, he was not part of the public Lady of the Dunes story in any meaningful way. After identification, his marriage to Ruth placed him close to the center. His earlier history made that closeness more significant. His death prevented prosecution. You can see how one fact after another settles into position, each with a muted sound, like cards being placed carefully on felt. Authorities eventually stated that the case was closed from their perspective, with Moldovin responsible. That statement belongs later in the file than the identification, and it shows how the work continued after Ruth's name returned. You can imagine investigators not stopping at who, but asking the next necessary question. Who was around her? What did records show? What did family remember? What had been known about her husband? The answer formed through that continued review. Even when a case is closed officially, the public may still feel the edges of unanswered questions. How exactly did the final days unfold? What did Ruth understand about her situation? What route brought her to Cape Cod? Were there witnesses who saw something ordinary and never knew it mattered? These questions can remain, not as cliffhangers, but as the natural gaps left by time. You can let them exist without forcing them to become suspense. In a sleep script, uncertainty can be held softly. We do not poke at it. We simply acknowledge that old investigations often have missing air between the facts. The facts stand like fence posts, and the spaces between them are not always filled. Ruth's name is known, the place is known, the date of discovery is known, the responsible person, according to authorities, is known. The precise private sequence, in every detail, may never be fully spoken. That is not unusual in cases solved after many years. The law and the family may receive enough truth to close one door, while history keeps a few drawers unopened. You can picture those drawers in the archive, labeled but undisturbed. They do not need to rattle in the dark. They are simply there, part of the file's quiet shape. The DUNES case remains especially memorable because the setting feels almost unreal beside the methodical work that solved it. DUNES suggests shifting, covering, erasing. Genealogy suggests connection, recovery, and lines that can be followed backward. The case begins in a landscape that hides edges and ends in a method that finds relationships across time. You can feel the contrast without making it dramatic. Sand and ancestry, wind and records, a beach path and a family tree. Those pairings give the story its atmosphere. The beach was open, yet the identity was hidden. The evidence was old, yet the technology was new. The clues were strange, yet the work was careful. Ruth was publicly unknown, yet privately connected to a web of relatives all along. You can sit with those opposites, because they are not contradictions. They are simply the way real mysteries often feel when they are finally understood. You may wonder what the young girl with the dog carried from that day. We do not need to know beyond what has been reported, but it is enough to imagine that some memories stay with a person, especially when childhood intersects with something adults cannot immediately explain. The dog pulling toward the dunes became the first movement in a decades-long investigation. A small, ordinary walk became part of a historical record. That, too, is strange in the quiet way life can be strange. The dog, the sand, the summer light, the first responders, the old notes, the reconstructions, the exhumations, the DNA, the genealogists, the family, the announcement. You can let that sequence pass slowly, not as a list to wake the mind, but as a line of lamps along a dark hallway. Each lamp shines on one part of the path, none shines on all of it. Together, they make movement possible. And now, as we remain with the file, the next pages invite us to look more closely at how the small physical clues survived in public memory, while the most important clue waited out of sight. The blue bandana, for example, carried a kind of visual power because people could imagine it. A bandana belongs to the senses. It has color, fold, fabric, and use. DNA has none of that to the naked eye. It cannot be pictured easily, and perhaps that is why it can feel almost ghostly when it becomes the evidence that finally speaks. You can hold the bandana in your mind without making too much of it. A square of cloth, a color associated with summer, a practical item against wind or sun. It may have belonged to Ruth, or it may have been connected to the scene in another way, but in the public story it became part of the image. People remember images. Detectives, however, have to remember that images are not always answers. They are starting places. The dental work was another starting place. Less visual, but highly practical. Dental identification has solved many cases because teeth survive when other forms of recognition fail, and because dental procedures can be distinctive. Fillings, crowns, extractions, bridges, and charts can all become part of a person's forensic signature. You can imagine an investigator hoping that a dentist somewhere would recognize the pattern. The hope was reasonable. It simply did not land where it needed to land. That kind of reasonable failure fills cold case files. Good ideas that do not solve the case. Promising routes that end. Accurate observations that lack a database. Useful details that arrive before the system exists to use them fully. The Dunes case had many of these. You can take comfort, in a thoughtful way, from the fact that failure did not mean uselessness. Each attempt shaped the next one. The reconstructions, too, were reasonable. If a person cannot be named through records, perhaps a face can stir recognition. If one reconstruction does not work, another might. If the public does not respond at first, a later article or television segment might reach a different viewer. You can imagine the face of the Lady of the Dunes appearing in newspapers over the years, each time asking quietly for someone to remember. The answer did not come that way, but the asking mattered. Public attention can be uneven, but in this case it helped keep the file from disappearing into obscurity. The Lady of the Dunes became one of those names people in true crime and unidentified person communities remembered. Some followed it carefully. Some repeated theories. Some studied maps or film stills. The attention was not always perfect, but it kept a measure of light on the case. You can feel the difference between harmful fascination and patient attention. The better kind tries to help without claiming more than it knows. Patient attention is what we practice tonight. You are not leaning forward for a twist. You are leaning back into the quiet work of understanding how an old mystery became an answer. The Dunes case rewards that slower posture because its solution is layered. If we move too quickly, we miss the fact that the weird evidence was not one object, but a conversation between old preservation and new interpretation. The first part of that conversation happened when the remains were retained for future study. The second happened when DNA technology improved enough to attempt difficult samples. The third happened when genealogy created a framework for indirect identification. The fourth happened when investigators used Ruth's name to examine her life. You can hear the rhythm of those steps, each one measured, none of them abrupt. The case advanced by becoming more readable over time. Readable is the right word for evidence. A clue is not useful merely because it exists. It must be read correctly. Sand can be read for tracks, but wind changes the page. Teeth can be read against records, but only if the right records are found. DNA can be read by machines, but its meaning may require family history. Human memory can be read in interviews, but it must be checked against documents. The DUNES case is a study in reading different kinds of pages. Some pages are literal: newspaper archives, death records, marriage certificates, reports, and genealogical documents. Some pages are bodily, DNA markers, dental patterns, age estimates, and forensic observations. Some pages are environmental: location, season, weather, geography, and access routes. You sit in the quiet study with all of them spread out, and the lamp gives each one a small, patient glow. The geography deserves another look, because geography often hides inside a case as background when it is really evidence. Provincetown sits at the far end of Cape Cod, narrow and surrounded by water, a place that can feel both remote and crowded depending on the season. In summer, visitors arrive in waves. In winter, the land feels more exposed. Race Point lies within that outer landscape, where dunes, beach, and scrub create pockets of privacy despite the openness. You can understand why investigators had to ask who could have been there and when. Access matters in such a place. Roads, parking areas, walking paths, beach routes, and local knowledge all shape possibility. A person unfamiliar with the area might stay near obvious paths. Someone more familiar might know where the dunes dipped out of sight. Investigators would have considered practical questions like these because place is not only scenery, place is behavior. It tells you how people could move, what they might see, and what they might miss. The dunes case began with what was missed until the dog found it. That fact lingers. The landscape had concealed the discovery enough that a person walking casually might not have noticed. Yet it was not so hidden that it could remain undiscovered forever. You can feel the uneasy balance of that, but we keep the tone soft. The important point is investigative. The location suggested both seclusion and access, a place near human movement, but not constantly observed. In 1974, gathering information around that access would have been slow. Investigators might ask local residents, businesses, lodging owners, and visitors if they remembered a woman matching the description. They might check reports of missing persons, abandoned vehicles, or unusual observations. But summer towns are full of brief encounters. A face seen once in passing can dissolve from memory quickly. You can imagine someone trying to remember a woman from a week earlier and finding only sunlight, noise, and crowds in the mind. This is another reason the case stayed difficult. Ruth may have been seen, but not remembered as Ruth. She may have passed through spaces where people noticed only a woman among many. Without her name, investigators could not ask the most useful questions. Did you see Ruth Marie Terry? Did she travel with Guy Moldavin? Did they stay here? Did anyone speak with them? Those questions only became possible after the genealogy. When you realize that, the importance of identification deepens. It did not simply satisfy public curiosity. It changed the investigative vocabulary. Before, questions had to be broad and descriptive. After, they could be specific and relational. Specific questions are stronger. They can be answered by records, witnesses, and timelines. The DUNES case moved from description to identity, and from identity to accountability, because specificity entered the room. Specificity also protects against myth. An unnamed case can become a vessel for many stories. A named person resists that. Ruth's life had facts, relationships, and records. She cannot be reduced to the dunes once her name is known. You can feel the ethical importance of that. It is easier to sensationalize an unknown figure. It is harder, and better, to speak gently about Ruth Marie Terry. We keep saying her name because the old case denied it to the public for so long. Ruth Marie Terry. The words are simple, but they do real work. They move the mind from image to person, They remind us that the beach, the bandana, and the DNA all point back to a woman who existed before the mystery. Every cold case asks for that same restoration, in its own way. In the quiet archive of the Dunes case, you might find photocopies of articles using the phrase Lady of the Dunes in large type. You might find later printouts with Ruth's name added. The contrast would be striking. One phrase describes where she was found, the other tells who she was. You can imagine placing the two pages side by side and feeling how much investigation can change a sentence. A sentence can change a family history for decades. There may have been no confirmed sentence explaining what happened to Ruth. Then, after identification and review, authorities could say she was the woman found in Provincetown. Later, they could say Moldavan was responsible. These official sentences do not carry all the private pain, but they create a public record that is no longer blank. You can feel the steadiness of that record forming. Records, once formed, can be passed on. Future relatives can search Ruth's name and find the truth more readily than earlier generations could. Researchers can study the case as an example of forensic genealogy. Investigators can cite it when asking why old evidence should be retested. The Dunes case becomes part of the larger memory of how patient work can return identities. That does not make the loss less real, but it gives the work a continued purpose. Purpose is important for detectives who spend years with unresolved files. They need to believe that waiting can still be active, that a case without daily leads can still be cared for. Ruth's identification supports that belief. It says that a file can be quiet for years and still not be dead. It says that evidence can outlast the moment that collected it. It says that the future may be able to use what the present cannot. You can imagine a cold case detective hearing about Ruth's identification and thinking of another box on another shelf. Perhaps a different unidentified person. Perhaps a missing woman from another decade. Perhaps a case with old clothing, old dental notes, and a partial biological sample. The lesson would not be loud, it would be practical. Check what remains. Ask what technology can do now. See whether the old silence is still necessary. In this way, the Dunes case reaches beyond itself, while staying rooted in itself. It is not only a famous Cape Cod mystery, it is a record of investigative patience across changing time. It shows the value of preserving evidence, revisiting assumptions, and using genealogy responsibly. It also shows the limits of late answers, because some voices were gone by the time the name returned. You can hold both truths together without needing to choose one. The file remains open on the desk in our imagining, though the official identification is no longer open. The pages lie flat. The lamp warms the paper. The night around the room is quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing slow. You are not trying to solve the case faster than the people who lived with it for decades. You are simply learning how they waited, how they returned, and how the smallest evidence eventually carried Ruth's name back into the light. As we move deeper into the evidence, the next thing to notice is how an old object can have two lives. One life belongs to the day it was used, when it was only a bandana, a pair of jeans, a dental appointment, a record signed in ink. The second life begins when investigators recognize it as evidence. In the Dunes case, some objects entered that second life immediately, while others waited years before anyone understood their full meaning. A bandana may remember sun and wind before it remembers evidence tape. Denim may remember ordinary movement before it remembers a photograph in a file. A dental chart may begin as a routine note in a quiet office, with a patient rinsing at a small sink, before it becomes a possible key in an unidentified person case. You can feel how the Dunes case asks us to look at ordinary objects twice. First as pieces of a life, then as fragments of investigation. The difficulty, of course, is that objects rarely explain themselves. They sit on the table and wait for context. A blue bandana can mean summer, travel, work, fashion, or coincidence. Expensive dental work can mean a dentist in one city or another, or a record that no longer exists. Even DNA, which feels so precise to us now, needs context before it becomes a name. In the Dunes case, the context arrived slowly, like dawn through a thin curtain. You turn the page and find yourself back in the early years, when the file still spoke mostly in descriptions. Investigators had an approximate age, a physical description, and evidence of dental care. They had the place, the date, and the things found nearby. They had questions about how long she had been there, and how she had reached the dunes. What they did not have was the one thing every other question wanted to lean on. They did not have Ruth. Without a name, even the timeline was softened at the edges. You could say when she was found. You could estimate other parts with professional care, but you could not trace her last confirmed days in the ordinary way, because no one knew which woman in which family had vanished into the record. You can imagine the frustration of that, not as an impatient feeling, but as a quiet pressure behind every page. The file had facts, but the facts did not yet have a home. Detectives are trained to work with partial things. Partial descriptions, partial memories, partial records, partial physical evidence. In the Dunes case, the partial nature of everything made patience essential. You could not force a match simply because one seemed close. You could not turn resemblance into identity. You could not turn public fascination into proof. Each clue had to wait beside the others until something strong enough connected them. That something, much later, was the genetic path. But before we return fully to the laboratory, it helps to sit with the long middle of the case, because the middle is where many cold cases live. Not at the beginning, when everything feels urgent, and not at the end, when announcements are made, but in the long in-between. You can picture years stacked like paper, each one adding a little dust to the file, each one also preserving the possibility that someone might return. In that middle time, the Lady of the Dunes became familiar to people who studied unidentified cases. Her reconstructions appeared in public appeals. Her case was compared to missing women. Amateur researchers and careful observers discussed her. Some focused on the physical details, some focused on geography, some focused on the unusual possibility of a connection to film footage. All of it showed that the case had not vanished, though attention alone could not finish the work. You can hear the quiet difference between attention and evidence. Attention is a light. Evidence is the path underfoot. Both can matter, but they are not the same. In the Dunes case, attention kept people aware of the unknown woman, while evidence waited for the method that could interpret it correctly. The public may have remembered the blue bandana, but the final identification came from something no passerby could have seen. There is a tenderness in invisible evidence. A visible object can be photographed, described, and imagined by strangers. Invisible evidence has to be trusted through process. We cannot look at a DNA profile and feel recognition in the human way. We rely on trained people, validated methods, careful records, and confirmation from relatives. You sit with that trust tonight, because the Dunes case depends on it. The unseen clue became the one that finally restored the visible life. The forensic genealogy process can be understood as a kind of quiet map-making. It begins with genetic markers, then moves toward relatives who share portions of that inheritance. Those relatives may be close, or they may be distant enough that the path winds through several generations. You can imagine the genealogist building branches patiently, writing surnames, checking dates, and crossing out assumptions that do not hold. It is detective work conducted through family history, and its pace is naturally slow. Records are not always clean. A name may be spelled differently from one document to another. A birthplace may be listed with slight variation. A person may use a middle name in one record and a first name in another. Marriages may change surnames. Moves may scatter a family across several states. You can feel how easy it would be to step onto the wrong branch if you wanted the answer too quickly. The Dunes case required the opposite impulse. It required calm doubt at every turn. Calm doubt is not the same as disbelief. It is the working mood of a good investigator. You allow a possibility to exist, then you test it. You let a name sit on the table, then you ask whether age, place, family, and absence all agree. You do not love the theory more than the facts. In Ruth's case, that discipline carried the search from distant genetic connections toward a woman whose life and disappearance fit the unknown remains from Provincetown. Once the name Ruth Marie Terry became likely, the investigation had to become intimate in a new way. It moved from public descriptors into private history. Relatives had to be contacted. Family lines had to be confirmed. Memories had to be gathered with care. You can imagine how a call like that begins. The voice on the phone measured and respectful. The listener on the other end perhaps sitting down without quite meaning to. Old questions have a way of changing the room when they arrive. For the family, the name Lady of the Dunes may have sounded at first like something from outside their lives. A famous unidentified case, a Cape Cod mystery, a phrase from articles and documentaries. Then, slowly, it would become connected to Ruth. You can imagine that mental movement, the public story crossing into private memory, the distance between Provincetown and family history closing all at once. It is not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It is simply life becoming reconnected to its missing part. Investigators had to honor that reconnection. The family was not a tool for the case, though family DNA and memory could help confirm it. They were people receiving late knowledge about someone who belonged to them. You can feel why careful notification matters. The words must be plain but gentle. The facts must be accurate but not careless. In cold case work, compassion is part of procedure, not an ornament placed after the evidence is done. The Dunes case also reminds us that identification can arrive after many of the people who needed it most are gone. Parents may have died. Siblings may have aged. Friends may no longer be reachable. The answer comes, but not always to everyone who asked the first questions. You can sit with that softly, because it is one of time's hardest facts. Cold cases are solved in the present, but they reach toward people who waited in the past. Still, the answer matters to those who remain, and to the record itself. Ruth's name restored accuracy. It corrected the public story. It gave investigators a path into accountability. It gave descendants and relatives a clearer history. You can imagine a family tree being updated, not merely with dates, but with an understanding that had been missing for nearly half a century. The branch that once ended in uncertainty could now be marked with truth. Truth, in this file, arrived in stages. First came the identification. Then came the renewed focus on Moldavan. Then came the official conclusion that he was responsible. Each stage required its own work. It would be too simple to say the DNA solved everything by itself. The DNA solved who she was. The rest of the investigation used that answer to examine what her life had placed around her. You can feel the order of it, like slow footsteps down a hallway. The hallway leads through old marriage records. Ruth married Guy Rockwell Moldavan in the early 1970s, not long before the discovery in Provincetown. That fact, once known, became important because a spouse is part of the immediate circle investigators must examine. You can imagine the marriage record as a simple official page, perhaps plain and unremarkable when created, later becoming a serious document in a decades-old case. Paper changes meaning when a missing name returns. Moldavan's own history gave investigators more to consider. Public accounts describe earlier disappearances connected to his family life, including the disappearance of his previous wife and stepdaughter, and later findings on property associated with him. We do not dwell on those details for effect. We let them remain factual, because they explain why investigators, after identifying Ruth, looked at him with grave attention. Patterns matter in detective work, especially when they cross years and households. You can imagine a detective placing the earlier file beside Ruth's file and reading both in silence. The desk may be crowded now, with photocopies, timelines, and notes arranged in careful stacks. The lamp makes pale rectangles on the paper. A pen rests in the fold of a notebook. Nothing moves quickly. The work is not to create a pattern, but to see whether the records show one. In this case, authorities concluded they did. That conclusion came after Moldavan's death, which changes the sound of the file. There is no interview room waiting, no living man to question. No courtroom where evidence can be tested in the way the public often expects. Instead, there is a posthumous investigative conclusion, grounded in what authorities could gather and review. You can feel the incompleteness of that, but also the importance a late conclusion can still return part of the truth. The word responsible carries weight. It does not fill every blank. It does not reconstruct every hour. It does not let Ruth answer in her own voice, but it tells the record where the evidence led. You can imagine that word entering the file carefully. After years in which even the victim's name was missing, the DUNES case had moved from unidentified to identified, and then from identified to attributed responsibility. That is a long journey for a file that began in shifting sand. Shifting sand is still a useful image, because the case kept changing shape as new methods arrived. In the 1970s, the sand held the physical scene. In the 1980s, and beyond, exhumations and examinations tried to extract more information. In the age of internet attention, the case gathered theories and public memory. In the era of forensic genealogy, the evidence finally held still enough to be named. You can feel each era leaving its own faint layer. The internet era deserves a quiet look too. Before the identification, online communities interested in missing and unidentified people discussed the Lady of the Dunes often. Some participants were careful, gathering records, comparing missing person reports, and correcting mistakes. Others repeated speculation with less caution. That is the nature of public mystery. You can imagine the glow of computer screens in many rooms, people reading about the case late at night, drawn by the hope that a detail might connect. There can be value in public attention when it remains respectful. A person might recognize a reconstruction. A relative might find an unidentified person listing. A researcher might notice a record that needs checking. But attention can also drift into certainty without evidence. The DUNES case teaches the need for softness and restraint. You can care about a mystery without claiming to solve it. You can notice a resemblance without turning it into identity. You can hold a possibility lightly. Holding possibilities lightly is difficult when a case has waited so long. People want the answer to be found. They want the strange clue to be meaningful. They want the frame from a film to matter, or the bandana to point directly to a scene, or a missing person report to finally match. You can understand that desire. It comes from compassion, curiosity, and discomfort with absence. But the file does not respond to desire. It responds to evidence. In Ruth's case, the strongest evidence was the kind that had to be developed, not merely noticed. Laboratory work created a profile. Genealogical analysis created a family path. Confirmation connected the path to Ruth. Investigation connected Ruth to Moldavan. Each step transformed raw material into knowledge. You can picture this transformation as a slow clarification of water in a glass, cloudiness settling bit by bit until the shape at the bottom can be seen. The first time officials publicly said Ruth's name, many people who had followed the Lady of the Dunes felt the case change in their own memory. The old reconstructions no longer had to carry the whole burden. The unknown woman had a birth name. She had a known age. She had places connected to her life. You can imagine someone reading the announcement quietly, perhaps at a kitchen table, and saying the name aloud because names ask to be spoken. Ruth Mary Terry, born in Tennessee, found in Massachusetts, identified through investigative genealogy, connected by marriage to Guy Rockwell Moldavan. These facts form a simple framework, and within that framework, many smaller human details can rest. We do not need to invent what is not known. We only need to hold what is known carefully enough that the story remains about her, rather than about the mystery alone. The old title, Lady of the Dunes, still belongs to the history of the investigation. It is how the public found the case. It is how the file was remembered. But tonight, as you continue through the pages, the title feels like an outer envelope, and Ruth's name is the letter inside. The envelope helped preserve the story until the letter could be read. Now the letter matters more. You can imagine that letter in a figurative sense, written not in one hand but in many. The first lines were written by the child and the dog who brought attention to the dunes. The next by responders and investigators. Others by forensic artists, medical examiners, technicians, genealogists, family members and officials. No one wrote the whole letter alone. It took nearly 48 years for the message to become clear enough to deliver. The delivery was late, but not empty. It carried identification, responsibility, and a corrected record. it also carried an example of how science can serve memory without replacing it. DNA did not make Ruth matter. She already mattered. DNA helped prove who she was, so the world could stop calling her unknown. You can feel the distinction, because it keeps the technology in its proper place. The tool is remarkable, but the person is the reason for using it. As you sit with the laboratory part again, imagine the sample as something profoundly quiet. It does not shine. It does not look like a clue from a story. It may be stored in a small tube, labeled with numbers, handled under bright light. The room is clean and controlled, with smooth surfaces and a faint chemical sterility. Outside that room are decades of uncertainty. Inside it, trained hands work slowly, because old evidence cannot be rushed into giving what it no longer has. The process likely involved extracting genetic material from remains that had been through time and previous handling. Difficult samples can produce incomplete or damaged information, and specialists must decide what can be used. You can imagine the patience required when a test does not yield enough at first, or when a profile needs refinement, or when contamination has to be ruled out. The work is technical, but the emotional purpose is simple. Someone is trying to find Ruth. Once a profile suitable for genealogy exists, the case changes rooms again. It moves from lab bench to research desk. The evidence becomes data, and the data becomes relationships. You can picture a family tree growing on a screen, branch by branch, with names appearing in boxes and lines joining generations. The work is quiet enough that someone walking past might not realize a cold case is moving. A researcher leans closer, a date is checked, a branch is corrected. The genealogist has to think both backward and forward. Backward to common ancestors shared by DNA matches, forward to descendants who could include the unidentified person. Along the way, records must be found and evaluated. A marriage record may explain a surname change. An obituary may list relatives. A census may place a family in a county. A birth record may confirm a child. You can hear the soft rhythm of this work, one document after another, one careful inference at a time. Inference is useful, but it must be labeled as inference until confirmed. That is another patient discipline. You may suspect a branch is correct, but you do not declare it too soon. You may see a woman whose age fits, but you still need the rest of the life to fit. In the DUNES case, the eventual identification required enough convergence that officials could speak with confidence. Confidence, when earned slowly, has a quiet sound. The sound might be a phone call placed after a long review. It might be an email to an investigator saying the genealogy has narrowed. It might be a meeting where several people look at the same name. You can imagine a room where no one raises their voice, because the importance of the moment makes loudness feel unnecessary. The paper is there. The data is there. Ruth's name is there. The silence around the table is full. After identification, investigators could ask family members about Ruth's life with more precision. They could ask about her marriage to Moldavin, about travel, about last contacts, about statements made after she disappeared from contact. These interviews would have required delicacy, because memories from decades earlier can be both precious and uncertain. You can imagine an investigator taking notes while someone searches through recollection, not forcing the memory, just giving it room to return if it can. A remembered remark can matter. A planned trip can matter. A change in behavior can matter. A spouse's explanation can matter. In the DUNES case, public accounts suggest that Moldavin told relatives different things about Ruth's absence, and that those accounts became significant once her identity was known. You can feel how a statement, long ago spoken in an ordinary room, can become evidence when time reveals what it was covering. Yet even here, we keep restraint. People remember under the conditions of their own lives. They may recall the emotional truth of a moment more clearly than the exact words. Investigators know this, and they compare memory with documents whenever possible. The patient detective does not demand that memory do more than it can. Instead, you let it stand beside records, and together they may form something stronger. Records around Moldavin's history were not dependent on memory alone. Earlier investigations, disappearances, and findings connected to his previous family life gave authorities a documentary background to consider. You can imagine the chill of reading those old facts, not because the language is dramatic, but because the pattern is serious. A prior disappearance in a household, then Ruth's disappearance after marriage, then her identification in the DUNES case. The documents would have spoken plainly. Plain documents can be the heaviest ones. A date of marriage, a date last seen, a property record, a police report, an official statement. They do not need poetic language to matter. You can sit with them under the lamp and feel how much a simple date can carry. In cold case work, the plainness of records is a kind of mercy. It keeps the investigator anchored when the story around the records becomes emotionally difficult. The DUNES case also shows how one person's hidden identity can delay understanding of another person's actions. Moldaven's relationship to Ruth was always real, but it could not guide the lady of the DUNES investigation until Ruth was identified. The link existed, but it was invisible to the file. That is a strange thought. Evidence can be true and still inaccessible. A connection can exist in the world for decades before any investigator has the key to see it. The key was Ruth's name. Once found, it unlocked more than a label. It unlocked her marriage history, family accounts, locations, and the relevance of Moldaven's past. You can imagine a series of drawers opening quietly after one central drawer is finally unlocked. The papers inside were not new in every case. Some had existed for years, but now they belonged to the right investigation. This is why unidentified person work is so foundational. It may seem, from the outside, like a separate task from solving responsibility, but identification can be the bridge to everything else. If you do not know who someone is, you may not know who had reason to harm them, who last saw them, who gave strange explanations, or who should have reported them missing. The DUNES case is a clear example. Name first, then context, then conclusion. You can rest with that order as the night deepens. Name first, context next, conclusion later. It is a soothing sequence, not because the facts are gentle, but because the method is disciplined. The mind can follow it without alarm. The case becomes a long, careful walk through evidence rather than a series of shocks. As the years passed before identification, the lady of the DUNES had been buried under a marker that could not carry her real name. That fact has its own quiet sorrow. A grave without a name is still a grave, and people may still visit, leave flowers, or think about the unknown person there. But a name changes how grief locates itself. You can imagine the difference between standing before an unknown marker and standing before one that says Ruth Marie Terry. The air around the act of remembrance changes. Even before Ruth was identified, people in Provincetown cared. Local memory held the case, and officials returned to it. That care matters, because unidentified people can be forgotten when no family is visible nearby. In the DUNES case, the local community and investigators kept the story alive long enough for science to catch up. You can feel the quiet responsibility of a town holding a stranger's unresolved name for many years. Provincetown itself has always held many stories. Artists, fishermen, visitors, writers, families, seasonal workers and travelers have passed through its narrow streets and open beaches. The DUNES case became one story among them, but one that carried a special stillness. You can imagine someone walking Commercial Street on a summer evening, hearing voices from restaurants and the clink of dishes, while far away in the dunes, the old question remained part of the town's undercurrent. That contrast is not meant to be unsettling. It is simply how places work. Joy and unanswered grief can exist in the same landscape. A beach can hold children playing, artists painting, tourists resting, and detectives measuring evidence in different years. Race Point did not become only the site of a mystery. It remained a beach, but the case added a layer of memory to the sand, and memory can be quiet without disappearing. The Cape Light is famous for its clarity. Painters have noticed it for generations. The way it falls across water and pale buildings, the way it changes with fog, season, and hour. In the DUNES case, that light becomes part of how we imagine the first scene, though the investigation itself had to work beyond beauty. You can see the light on dry grass, on camera equipment, on the sleeve of an officer taking notes. Beauty does not cancel seriousness. It simply sits beside it. In cold case narration, it is important to let places remain themselves. We do not make the dunes sinister. We do not make the lab magical. We do not make the archive gloomy beyond recognition. Each place is ordinary in its own way, and that ordinariness helps the listener stay grounded. The Dunes case happened in real spaces where people worked, walked, waited, and remembered. The calm truth of those spaces is enough. The evidence rooms, too, were ordinary. Shelves, boxes, logs, seals, fluorescent lights, perhaps a clock that ticked too loudly in the afternoon quiet. A person entering might smell cardboard, dust, and the faint metallic scent of filing cabinets. You can imagine the case box being lifted, its weight modest, but meaningful. Inside it, the old reports did not know that genealogy would one day ask for them. They simply waited. Waiting objects can change history when the world learns how to use them. That thought repeats softly throughout Ruth's case. The retained remains, the records, the photographs, the earlier reports, the family documents, all became useful in layers. A case solved by weird evidence is also a case solved by ordinary storage. Without preservation, there is no later miracle. Without labels, there is no reliable chain. Without the old notes, the new answer floats. The word miracle is perhaps too bright for the work, so we can set it aside and use another word: continuity. Continuity is what allowed the Dunes case to move from 1974 to 2022 without losing itself. Different people handled different parts, yet the file remained connected enough to be understood. You can hear continuity in the repeated reopening, retesting, and rechecking. It is not glamorous, it is faithful. Faithfulness in investigation looks like returning to what still troubles the record. A detective may retire, but the question remains. A lab method may fail, but a later method may work. A reconstruction may not produce identification, but it may keep public memory alive. Each attempt says, in effect, this person still deserves her name. In Ruth's case, that faithfulness lasted long enough to matter. You can imagine the old case file on a desk in several different decades. In the 1970s, the paper is fresh, and the shock still close. In the 1980s, the first renewed examinations suggest stubborn hope. In the 2000s, computers and DNA begin to change the possibilities. In the 2020s, genealogy finally narrows the path. The desk changes. The people change. The question remains, then finally answers. When the answer came, the case's old evidence could be reread with a new tenderness. The pink toenail polish was no longer a detail about an unknown woman, but about Ruth. The dental work was no longer merely distinctive, but part of Ruth's history of care. The location was no longer only where the Lady of the Dunes was found, but where Ruth's absence became public. You can feel how a name humanizes every object around it. Humanizing does not mean imagining beyond the evidence. It means refusing to let evidence become detached from the person. A bandana is not just a clue, it may be something she chose or used. A dental chart is not just a route to identification. It came from appointments, discomfort, expense, and ordinary care. A DNA profile is not just a laboratory product, it is inherited connection. You can sit with those meanings gently. The Dunes case also invites reflection on how unidentified women have often been named by place. Lady of the Dunes. Other cases have similar labels, built from locations, clothing, or circumstances. These names help investigators and the public refer to someone when the true name is missing, but they can also make the person seem distant, almost symbolic. Ruth's identification reminds us that every such label is temporary if the work succeeds. The goal is always the real name. You can imagine an investigator looking at another unidentified person file with that principle in mind. The label is useful, but it is not enough. Somewhere behind it is a birth name, a childhood, a family structure, a set of lived days. The work is to find the path back. Ruth's case shows that path can be long and still worth walking. The length of the path is part of why the solution felt so striking. 48 years is longer than many careers, longer than many marriages, longer than a child growing into middle age. The world of 1974 and the world of 2022 almost seem to belong to different eras. Yet the evidence connected them. You can picture a line stretched across those decades, thin but unbroken, from the dunes to the genealogy desk. Along that line, cultural memory changed. In the early years, local newspapers and police bulletins carried the appeal. Later, television segments and books may have renewed interest. Later still, online databases and forums preserved details for a wider audience. Finally, official forensic genealogy moved the case from memory into identification. You can feel the gradual widening of the circle, from town to region to national attention to a scientific network of relatives and records. Widening circles can help, but they also require careful control. Too much speculation can blur facts. Too much certainty from outsiders can hurt families. Too much fascination with odd details can overshadow the person. The Dunes case, now that Ruth is known, gives us a chance to rebalance the story. We can let the odd clues stay interesting, while keeping them in service of her identity rather than the other way around. The phrase "weird evidence" may draw the listener to the case, but the calm center is not weirdness. It is restoration. The evidence that seemed strange, the DNA extracted from long-preserved remains and read through family history, restored a name. That is the heart of it. You can feel how the strangeness softens when placed beside the purpose. The method is remarkable, but the purpose is simple and human. Restoration can happen quietly. No one needs to shout in a press conference. No one needs to dramatize the laboratory. The power lies in the plain statement. She has been identified as Ruth Marie Terry. That sentence changes almost everything that can be changed after so many years. It does not change what happened. It does not restore the lost time, but it restores truth to the record, and truth has its own kind of peace. Peace may be too complete a word, because the case still carries sadness, but there can be steadiness. There can be relief from uncertainty. There can be a sense that patient work mattered. You can imagine investigators feeling that steadiness when the identification was confirmed, not celebrating loudly, but sitting for a moment with the knowledge that the unknown woman was unknown no longer. As you continue through the file, the role of official partnerships becomes visible. Local authorities, state medical examiners, federal agencies, forensic laboratories, and genealogical specialists all may touch a case like this. Each has a different skill, a different set of records, a different authority. The Dunes case required cooperation across those boundaries. You can imagine emails, evidence transfers, meetings, and careful language moving between offices. Cooperation can sound bureaucratic, but in cold cases it is often essential. One office may hold the original file. Another may hold remains or forensic reports. Another may have access to national databases. A specialized company or laboratory may have the tools to develop genealogical data. The family may hold memory no database contains. You can feel how the answer forms between people, rather than inside one person's mind. That shared work fits the case's long shape. No single detective carried it from beginning to end. No single tool solved every question. The case moved because many people added something. A child noticed. Responders recorded. Medical examiners examined. Artists reconstructed. Scientists tested. Genealogists traced. Relatives confirmed. Investigators concluded. You can hear the quiet procession of roles, each one stepping forward when its time came. The passage of roles across time can be comforting in a solemn way. It means care does not have to depend on one person's memory alone. Systems, when they function well, can hold a question beyond an individual life. The Dunes case was held by systems and by people, imperfectly but long enough. You can imagine a folder moving from one set of hands to another, always at risk of being forgotten, yet somehow kept within reach. Within reach is all a cold case needs until the right moment arrives. The file does not have to be solved every day. It has to be findable, preserved, and taken seriously when new opportunities appear. Ruth's case reached that moment when investigative genealogy became strong enough and accessible enough to be applied. Then the old evidence, once merely preserved, became active again. Active evidence changes the mood of a room. A file that has sat quietly for years suddenly requires calls, forms, permissions, and reviews. People who knew it as an old case must treat it as present work. You can imagine the soft bustle after a long silence. Not frantic, but purposeful. A box comes down from the shelf. A lab is contacted. A meeting is scheduled. The old question wakes, not loudly, but with intention. The DUNES case woke that way more than once. Each exhumation, each reconstruction, each renewed appeal was a kind of waking. Some wakings led back to waiting. The final one led to Ruth's name. This pattern can teach patience to anyone listening in the dark. Not every return brings an answer, but without returning, the answer has no chance to arrive. You might think of the investigation as tide work. The tide comes in, bringing new possibility. The tide goes out, leaving the case quiet again. Years later, another tide comes. A new method, a new database, a new tip, a new family connection. The shore is the same, but the water changes what can be seen. In the DUNES case, the tide that mattered most was forensic genealogy, and it revealed what earlier tides had left covered. The metaphor belongs naturally to Cape Cod, where the sea is always part of perception. But the actual work was not poetic. It was precise. Samples, profiles, records, confirmations. The calm beauty of the place and the technical discipline of the solution belong together because real investigations often contain both. You can hold the sound of waves in one ear and the hum of laboratory equipment in the other. The hum of equipment is steady, almost sleep-like. Machines process, analyze, and report. People verify, interpret, and decide what the results mean. The machine does not know Ruth. The people do. Or rather, the people come to know her through the evidence. That distinction matters. Technology extends human attention. It does not replace human responsibility. In the DUNES case, the responsibility was to use the technology carefully enough that Ruth's name could be trusted. Trust is built through confirmation. A genealogical lead points to a family. A family sample supports the lead. Records align with the unknown person's estimated age and disappearance. Investigators check whether the conclusion fits the whole case. Only then can a public identification be made. You can feel the slow layering of confidence, like blankets laid one over another on a cold night. The image of blankets may seem far from an evidence file, but the feeling is similar. Each layer provides warmth, coverage, and steadiness. One record alone might be too thin. One DNA match alone might be incomplete. One memory alone might be fragile. Together, they become strong enough to rest on. Ruth's identification rested on that layered strength. The aftermath of identification brought renewed attention to Moldovan, and there the layers also mattered. Marriage records placed him close. Family accounts described his conduct after Ruth was gone. His prior history raised serious concern. The timing connected. The official conclusion followed. You can imagine investigators not needing one loud piece, when several quiet pieces aligned. The case did not shout. It settled. Settling is a good word for the way old evidence can finally find its place. For years, the bandana, denim, dental details, and location sat in the file without a name. After Ruth was identified, they settled around her. For years, Moldovan's relevance to the Lady of the Dunes was hidden because her identity was hidden. After Ruth was identified, his connection settled into view. The entire case became less fog and more arrangement. Arrangement is what you do as the quiet detective tonight. You arrange pages, not to create drama, but to understand. The first page is race point. The next is the initial description, then dental work, then reconstructions, then exhumations, then public theories, then DNA, then genealogy, then Ruth, then Moldavan. Each page has its place, and the order helps the mind rest. Resting with a case may sound unusual, but this channel's work is exactly that. We sit with unanswered questions and patient answers, not to sharpen fear, but to honor the slow human process of finding truth. The DUNES case is suited to that posture because its solution did not come from speed. It came from years of returning. You can let the rhythm of that returning be gentle, like pages turning at the same unhurried pace. The pages near the middle include the facial reconstructions, and we can linger there a little longer. A reconstruction is a hopeful approximation, Built from anatomy and artistry, the artist must choose features that cannot be known perfectly, such as expression, fullness, and the living softness of a face. You can imagine the concentration in the room, the clay taking shape under careful fingers, the silence broken only by a tool set down on the table. The result is always both useful and incomplete. It can prompt recognition, but it can also mislead if treated too literally. Hairstyle, weight, age, and expression can change how people perceive a face. In the Lady of the Dunes case, reconstructions kept the unknown woman visible, but they could not fully restore Ruth. Only identification could do that. You can appreciate the reconstructions as acts of care without asking them to do what they could not. One reconstruction might reach one audience. Another might reach another. Over the years, the face changed in public appeals because new techniques and interpretations emerged. Each version was an attempt to bring someone forward from anonymity. You can picture them printed in articles, displayed on websites, perhaps shown in documentary segments, each one quietly asking whether anyone knew this woman. The answer was not found there, but the question stayed alive. Questions that stay alive can become answers when tools change. That is a recurring comfort in the DUNES case. The unanswered question did not mean the work was meaningless. It meant the answer had not yet met its method. When the method arrived, all the earlier asking became part of the path. You can feel the continuity between the clay face and the DNA profile. Even though they seem so different, both were attempts to return identity. Identity is more than a name, but a name is where public restoration begins. Ruth's identity includes her family, her history, her relationships, her movement through states, her age, and the circumstances investigators later pieced together. Yet the name opened the door to all of that. Before Ruth, the file had only descriptors. After Ruth, the descriptors became attached to a person who could be remembered more fully. You can imagine a photograph of Ruth, if one is in the family records or public accounts, being viewed differently after the identification. A real face, not a reconstruction. The ordinary posture of someone alive in her own time, hair shaped by the style of the day, eyes looking toward a camera without knowing how many years later strangers would say her name with care. Such photographs can be hard to look at, but they also restore proportion. The mystery is not larger than the person. Keeping the person larger than the mystery is one of our quiet duties as we continue. The DUNES case can attract attention because of its odd clues and long delay, but Ruth remains central. We mention Moldovan only as necessary. We mention theories only in relation to evidence. We mention theories only in relation to evidence. We mention the beach not as a spectacle, but as the place where the investigation began. This balance lets the story stay calm and respectful. Respect also means not pretending that every detail is known. Some old cases leave spaces that are not ours to fill. We can say Ruth was identified. We can say authorities named Moldovan responsible. We can say the identity question was solved through forensic genealogy after decades. We do not need to invent conversations, motives, or final moments beyond the record. The quiet power of the DUNES case is already there. The record includes official care after the discovery. It includes burial and later exhumation. It includes attempts at identification through dental records and missing person comparisons. It includes renewed forensic work. It includes the genealogical identification announced in 2022. It includes the later conclusion about Moldovan. You can trace that official care like a line of stitching through fabric, nearly invisible from a distance, but holding the whole piece together. Stitching is a useful image because it is slow, repetitive, and necessary. One stitch does not make the seam. Many stitches do. A detective's note, a lab submission, a family interview, a database search, a genealogy record. Each one is a stitch. In the DUNES case, the fabric held long enough for Ruth's name to be sewn back into it. You can feel the plain tenderness of that, without needing to make it ornate. The physical landscape of Race Point also has its own stitching. Grass roots hold dunes in place. Fences sometimes guide sand. Paths appear where feet repeat the same motion. Wind loosens what roots try to hold. The case mirrors that landscape in a quiet way. Some details stayed fixed. Others shifted. Investigators had to know the difference. You, turning the pages tonight, can feel the sand, and the paper belonging to the same patient story. The story is not a chase, it is a return. We return to the place. We return to the evidence. We return to the name. We return to the family tree. We return to the question of who was near Ruth. Each return gives a little more. The rhythm is slow enough to breathe with. In the room with the lamp, the file does not demand anything from you except attention. Attention can be gentle. You can notice the date without bracing, the 26th of July, 1974. You can notice the place without fear, Race Point, Provincetown, Massachusetts. You can notice the old label without letting it replace her, Lady of the Dunes. You can notice the restored name with care, Ruth Marie Terry. Each fact rests in its own place, and the mind can move among them quietly. The first responders in 1974 could not have known the restored name. They worked from what they had. That is worth remembering whenever we look back from a solved identification. It can be tempting to judge the past by the tools of the present, but the past did not have those tools. It had field notes, photographs, dental comparisons, and public appeals. The Dunes case honors those older methods even as it shows their limits. Limits are not failures when people work within them honestly. The dental record search was logical. The reconstructions were logical. The missing person comparisons were logical. The exhumations were logical. Each effort belonged to its era of possibility. The final identification did not make those efforts foolish. It completed what they had been trying to do. You can see the investigation as a relay, not a competition between old and new. In a relay, one runner carries the work as far as they can, then passes it on. The first investigators carried the scene and records. Forensic artists carried the public image. Medical examiners carried the physical examination. DNA specialists carried the biological possibility. Genealogists carried the ancestry. Later investigators carried the accountability question. Ruth's case crossed the finish line of identification because the baton was not dropped. That image may be a little more active than our room tonight, so we let it soften back into paper. A folder passed from hand to hand, a label updated, a box returned to a shelf, then taken down again. The quiet rhythm of custody and care. The Dunes case did not move fast, but it moved. It moved enough. Enough is an important word in old investigations. You may not get everything. You may get enough to identify, enough to notify family, enough to name responsibility, enough to correct the public record, enough to close a particular question. The Dunes case did not give every answer anyone might want, but it gave enough to return Ruth's name and enough for authorities to state who they believed was responsible. The remaining unknowns do not undo the knowns. They simply remind us that time has edges. A living witness may be gone. A memory may be incomplete. A document may never have existed. A suspect may have died before science caught up. You can accept those limits without letting them swallow the progress. Ruth is known now. The Dunes case no longer begins and ends with an unidentified woman. That matters. As the night settles further, you might feel the file becoming less sharp and more spacious. The facts remain, but they are no longer crowded. The sand, the bandana, the dental work, the reconstructions, the DNA, the family tree, the name, the husband, the conclusion. Each one has room. This is how a calm mind can hold a difficult case, by letting the facts breathe instead of stacking them into urgency. Breathing room is also what investigators need. Cold case work can punish haste. A rushed assumption can misdirect years of effort. A premature public claim can hurt the wrong family. A careless comparison can create false hope. The Dunes case benefited from the final answer being confirmed before it was announced. You can feel the care in that waiting, even after 48 years had already passed. It may seem strange to wait carefully after waiting so long, but that is exactly when care matters most. A case known publicly for decades gathers emotional weight. Many people are watching. Families may be involved. The name, once spoken, cannot be taken back without harm. Investigators had to be sure. In Ruth's case, Certainty had to be earned one careful step at a time. The earning of certainty is quiet work. It happens in records, labs, interviews, and reviews. It happens when someone says, "Check that again." It happens when a genealogist rebuilds a branch to make sure no other person fits better. It happens when an investigator compares a family account with known dates. You can imagine the small fatigue of that work, the dry eyes after hours at a screen, the stiff back after leaning over files, the cooling coffee beside the keyboard. Those bodily details matter because investigation is human labor. We often talk about cases as if they solve themselves once technology arrives, but people still do the work. People make the calls, read the records, notice inconsistencies, and decide when evidence is strong enough. The DUNES case was solved through technology, guided by human patience. Without that guidance, data would remain data. Data becomes meaning only when placed in a life. Ruth's DNA profile became meaningful because it pointed to a family, then to a woman, then to a history that fit the unknown remains. The family tree became meaningful because it led to Ruth. The records became meaningful because they connected Ruth to Moldavin and to the time frame. You can feel the transformation from numbers and names into a coherent story, though we never let coherence erase sorrow. Sorrow is present, but it is not the volume of the piece. The volume remains low, the tone remains steady. We are reading by lamplight, not standing in a storm. The DUNES case deserves that quieter register because its most profound moment was not a dramatic confrontation, but the restoration of a name after decades. That kind of moment asks for stillness. Stillness does not mean nothing happens. It means we notice what happens without forcing it into sharp angles. Ruth's identification happened after laboratory work, genealogical research, family confirmation, and official review. The conclusion about Moldavin happened after investigators considered her known life and his history. These are significant movements. They simply happen at the pace of old truth, which is rarely sudden to the people doing the work. To outsiders, the announcement may have felt sudden. One day, the Lady of the Dunes was unidentified, and the next day the public knew Ruth Marie Terry. But inside the investigation, the answer had been forming through many steps. That difference between public suddenness and private patience appears often in solved cold cases. You can remember it whenever a headline says a mystery has been solved overnight. Usually the night was much longer than that. In Ruth's case, the night lasted nearly half a century. During that time, the beach kept changing. The town kept living. Forensic science kept developing, and relatives kept carrying whatever uncertainty they had. The file waited through all of it. It did not wait empty. It waited with evidence. That distinction matters. Evidence waiting is not silence without substance. It is substance without the right interpreter. The right interpreter finally came through forensic genealogy. You can imagine it almost as a translator arriving in a room where a witness has been speaking an unknown language for years. The witness had always had something to say. Now someone could understand. The DNA did not change its story. The method changed our ability to hear it. In the DUNES case, that hearing brought Ruth's name forward. Forward is where the file moves now, into the implications of that name. Ruth's known life created a trail investigators could follow backward from the DUNES, and forward from her family history. Public accounts describe how she had roots in Tennessee, connections elsewhere, and a marriage to Moldavin. These facts are not many, but they are enough to place her back into the world. You can feel the difference between a floating description and a life with geography. Geography can be emotional as well as physical. Tennessee suggests one beginning. Michigan and California suggest movements across distance. Massachusetts suggests the final public discovery. Each place holds different air, different roads, different records, different people who might have known her. The DUNES case spans those places quietly, reminding us that a person's life cannot be contained by the location where they are found. That is especially important here. For decades, the landscape named her Lady of the Dunes. But Ruth's life began elsewhere, and her relationships existed elsewhere. The Dunes were part of her story, not the whole of it. You can let that thought settle like a blanket over the old title. The title remains historically useful, but Ruth's name is truer. The official conclusion about Moldavin also belongs to that truer story. It places responsibility not on an unknown stranger from the beach, but on a man connected to Ruth by marriage. It gives the case a domestic and relational context that was hidden for decades, that can feel heavy, but again, we keep the pace calm. The importance lies in understanding how identification allowed investigators to see proximity that had always existed but could not be recognized. Proximity is often the first question in investigations. Who was near? Who knew? Who traveled with? Who had access? In the Lady of the Dunes phase of the case, proximity was almost impossible to map. After Ruth's identification, it became clearer. Moldovan was not merely a name in another file, he was her husband. That one fact changed the investigative landscape more than any public theory had. The landscape of suspicion, if we can use that word gently, became narrower, not because detectives wanted a simple answer, but because the records pointed toward one. Moldovan's history, his connection to Ruth, and the accounts surrounding her absence formed the basis for the official statement. You can imagine the care with which authorities would phrase such a conclusion when the suspect was deceased. The words had to be supported because there would be no trial to test them publicly. The absence of a trial leaves the case with a particular quietness. There are no transcripts of testimony resolving disputed details, no cross-examination, no verdict form. Instead, there is the investigative record and the official conclusion. You can feel both the value and the limitation of that. The value is that Ruth's case no longer remains without an attributed responsible person. The limitation is that the public story cannot include the full procedural closure of a courtroom. Cold cases often end this way when time is long. The answer arrives after legal possibility has narrowed. The person believed responsible may be dead. Witnesses may be gone. Some records may be incomplete. Yet investigators still work, because naming the truth matters even when prosecution is no longer possible. The Dunes case sits in that category, and its dignity comes from saying what can be said without pretending more can be recovered. As we continue, the file seems to breathe between two kinds of resolution. One resolution is strong and complete. Ruth Marie Terry was identified. The other is official but limited by time. Authorities named Moldovan responsible after his death. You can hold both in your mind without tension. They are different kinds of answers. One restores identity. The other assigns responsibility within the boundaries of available evidence and legal reality. Boundaries are part of every investigation. Scientific boundaries, legal boundaries, memory boundaries, evidence boundaries. The Dunes case crossed some boundaries through new methods, but others remained. You can sit with that truth peacefully. A case does not have to answer every possible question to have been changed profoundly by the answers it did find. Profound change can look very simple on paper. A name field updated, a case status changed, a family notified, a press release issued, a suspect named. These are ordinary administrative actions, but behind them is a lifetime of unanswered questions. You can imagine how the paper looks almost too plain for what it carries. That plainness is one reason official documents can feel so moving in old cases. They do not decorate the truth, they hold it. The old evidence, once held for decades, now has a different future. It may remain stored, but its purpose has shifted. It no longer has to wait to identify Ruth. It may remain as part of the case record, as part of the explanation, as part of the proof of how the answer was reached. You can imagine the box returning to a shelf with its work partly fulfilled. Not forgotten, not discarded, but changed. Changed objects are still objects. The bandana, if preserved, is still cloth. The reports are still paper. The genetic data is still data. But their meaning has moved. Before, they pointed toward an unknown woman. Now, they point back to Ruth. That reversal is gentle but powerful. Evidence that once asked a question now helps tell an answer. The answer begins again with her name, and then widens into the patient work that made it possible. You can feel the night's rhythm returning to the desk, the lamp, the paper, the slow breath. Outside our imagined room, the world of the case stretches across beaches, offices, labs, and family homes. And that is where the case rests now, with one great answer finally given, and another still waiting. The woman once known only as the Lady of the Dunes has been identified as Ruth Marie Terry, but her killing has not been solved. Her case remains an open homicide investigation, and the person responsible has not been brought to justice. So you can let the story settle in that truthful place, neither forcing certainty where there is none, nor leaving her unnamed in the old dark. Ruth is no longer only a description in a file, no longer only a location, no longer only the image of a woman found among sand and scrub and summer light. She has been returned, as much as time allows, to the shape of a life, a daughter, a sister, a wife. A person who moved through rooms, roads, conversations, ordinary weather, and whose name now stands where silence stood for so long. And still, there is the unfinished part. Somewhere within the remaining records, within old recollections, within the lives that crossed hers, there may yet be a detail that matters. It may be small. It may be a date remembered differently, a trip reconsidered, a name seen again after many years, something that once seemed too slight to carry weight. Cases like this sometimes move slowly, almost invisibly, until one patient thread begins to loosen the knot. But tonight, you do not have to solve what remains unsolved. You only have to hold the ending gently, as it is. The dunes are quiet now in the mind, the tide far off, the grasses bending in the dark, the old file closed but not gone. The lamp on the desk can be turned down, the papers can rest. Ruth's name can remain, clear and steady, after all those years of waiting. And as the room grows softer around you, the final thought is a simple one. Some answers arrive late, but when they do, they still matter, and they can still bring a lost name home.